This episode is brought to you exclusively by Speedy Comics. Everything else is just merchandise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special podcast episode. Today, I'm joined by a legendary comic book writer who is, first of all, the first ever writer who has written Superman and has appeared on Super-Heroes of Arabia podcast. But most importantly, he is the individual who was the successor of Chris Claremont when it came to the 1990s X-Men titles. He is the person behind Age of Apocalypse. He was the main creative force within the team that gave us Executioner's Song, Fatal Attractions, Age of Apocalypse, Operation Zero Tolerance, X-Men Onslaught, you name it. Without taking much of your time, ladies and gentlemen, and every X-Men fan out there, please welcome Mr. Scott Lobdell. Mr. Lobdell,
Oh, wait, I'm pausing for the applause.
thank you, sir, for taking out the time. We have been going back and forth, and you have been quite busy in the last few years and especially recently because you have transitioned from the world of comics to the world of screenplay and the world of Netflix, if you will. But today I am basically reaching out to the X-Men legend here, and I want to start out with basically the first question just to understand what made Scott Lobdell as he is known for today. Tell us something that when was the first time you came across any comic, whether it was DC or Marvel comic, before you became the writer?
My memory, I believe, was Avengers 136, which featured the Beast trying to join the Avengers.
Right.
And I had this vague recollection from childhood that the Beast wore like a yellow and black outfit, and he had big hands and he had big feet. So then to see Beast as this big furry beast, I was like, wow, that is so cool. And it's interesting because at the time, it was always drilled into your head when you're a comic book writer that each issue is someone's first issue. So you had to bring them along, maybe make a nod or two in a panel or two saying, oh, this is when Daredevil met Karen Page or something, like some basic idea. But the idea was to write the comic book so that you could pick up a comic book and feel that you knew basically what was going on. Nowadays, I don't know why Marvel did it. I think to their tremendous detriment, but they replaced all that with these title pages that, are paragraph on paragraph about, who did this and how did they come to Muir Island and what did they do and they got there and these people jumped them and now it's like, like you take everything that would have gone into the issue to bring you along on this wave and it's all replaced by like a pretty lifeless synopsis of what's going on. And I don't know, so to me, like I remember being pulled right into that issue of, even though I had no idea about Moondragon or any of that stuff, but I came along upon reading it. And nowadays they don't do that. Even when I was at DC for a while, I would have these moments of characters sort of reintroducing themselves to each other or something, or to the audience, essentially saying, this is what you missed, and this is how these two characters know each other. And people at the time were like, oh, he writes old fashioned, he doesn't know. I'm like, I don't know. I think it was pretty solid back then, Nowadays, I'm just not attracted to modern day comic books with all their gobbledygook.
I remember because when we were reading your stories in X-Men, and for example, there would be very straight to the point, short references that, for example, if we are talking about the death of Jean Grey, so there would be a caption from Bob Harris that would say that this happened in X-Men one something issue number like this. There would be an asterisk. And that would give us the suspense basically to build up our collection basically and to read those stories.
Yeah, to go back and find that issue. Nowadays, it's like you look at that title page and you're like, okay, turn the page. What's going to happen? Like I think it was a really bad idea. So, But I also think I'll just tell you it used to be you could pick up you go to the comic book store, and the comic book store would be have all the books facing you so you could see what was in each book. And you'd see, Wolverine, Magneto ripping out Wolverine's skeleton, or you could see, Spider Man cradling a dead Gwen Stacy. And you're like, my God, I got to read that. Holy shit, what is this about? And then I guess it was shortly after I left, but I think it started with the Marvel Knights, but somebody upstairs was like, if we have them do just a regular cover, we can use that cover for like t-shirts and all the other stuff. And so what happened was, like, if you look at the first, I don't know, 100 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, if you put them on a rack, all you would see is, him on a lamppost, him leaping at you, him clinging to the side of a building, him standing on a bus, him, it's like, they just it'd be like releasing movies without any trailers, where you just go, oh, there's a movie out. Oh, I should go see it. What's it about? I don't know. Spider-Man is standing on a bus, though. You're like, so it's like they really, it's weird too, because you have something called, you put out the advertisement for the book, and the retailers say, okay, this is what's going to happen in issue 3, 4, 5, 6, blah, blah, blah. And so they order 3 months beforehand, somewhere in the late uh, two, 2000s, 2000. They started this thing where they were like, oh, we're going to show you the 5-page preview of this issue that comes out today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yes, I remember that one. Yes.
And it's like, okay, well, imagine if you went to see a movie trailer and it was 25 minutes of the movie. You'd be like, like literally they're showing you 25% of this comic book that the retailers didn't order for you. So even if you like that first 25%, and you go, oh, I'm gonna check out Daredevil this month. That looks interesting. Then you go into the store, and the store owners are like, hey, we ordered 5 issues of Daredevil because that's who comes in and buys it every month.
Right.
So I don't know what to tell you. Maybe we'll reorder it. Maybe we can get it on reorder. But it's just such the marketing that takes place is just so counterintuitive, you know. So I don't know.
I'm glad you mentioned marketing. Why? Because your era is basically defined by, I mean, I'm one of those who doesn't agree with those individuals who call 90s gimmick covers era. I find that era to be peak marketing when it came to Marvel. And there is a good reason behind that because we had a groundbreaking animated series that came in, which is X-Men animated series released in 1992 or 93, if I can imagine. Furthermore, I mean, these trading cards that I have over here with me, these started in 1991 in Marvel, and they continued well during the time when you and your team were basically publishing one major story and crossover after another. And these were our biggest sources before there was such a thing called Wikipedia. Then we also had the action figures, which I have with me over here. So I've got this cable action figure. We are seeing everything happening. I mean, I was in the US in 1994 and I saw with my own eyes X-Men were everywhere. And there was some really quality merch coming out, but that merch was not coming out at the expense of stories. No, the stories themselves were doing marvelous. And when I say they were doing marvelous, here's the proof because I have collected almost every single issue of the crossover events that were done by you. This is the top, which is Executioner's Song, and then the bottom is Zero Tolerance. But one other bit is which I was really shocked and surprised. In your time, you and your team were responsible for not only celebrating but also planning out the 30th anniversary for X-Men, while also working alongside the Avengers team to make it a joint effort, a joint promotion, a joint marketing exercise. We had the Blood Ties crossover event between the Avengers and the X-Men. And then on a separate note, there were so many amazing stories, limited series, so forth. Why did, I mean, I want you to basically provide your observation about what happened during, according to your perspective, when it came to the 60th anniversary of Avengers and X-Men. What was going through your mind? You had Fabian Nicieza, you had Larry Hama, you had Bob Harris, who was responsible for being the editor in chief at the time after Tom DeFalco was moved to writing. I mean, what were you guys thinking at the time? This is pre internet, and you were able to achieve so much out of it.
I always heard people complain about the covers only in the sense that it meant they, quote, had to buy more, or if there was a hologram on the cover,
Yes.
they charged them extra for that. And people would say, well, I don't think that's fair. And I said, you know what? I'm only and 100% responsible for the story that you read. So that's where I concentrated my effort was, like Generation X #1 is a perfect example. Like, I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a perfect comic book, and no one ever accused it of being perfect, but I think as a first issue, it was really, really solid and brought in these new characters and introduced you to them and but it was also the first Holoflex cover with
Yes.
the chromium, you know.
Yes. Chromium cover.
Yeah, and was it cool? Sure, it was absolutely cool, but that didn't involve me at all. Like my feeling is that okay, if they're going to charge extra, I'm just going to make sure this issue is extra. I'm going to make it worth the price of what they charge it. And pretty much that was always my feeling in crossovers and everything else. Like I have to correct you about something if I may, is that when I got there, it was like Fatal Attractions, it was Executioner Song, there's something else, but I really didn't do when I came on, Fabian was really knee deep into all his crossovers. And it really wasn't until Age of Apocalypse that Bob came to me and said, what do you want to do? And up until then, I would just take Fabian's cue. And what Fabian would do, and it was what was done at the time, so it's not a slam on Fabian, but what was done at the time was if you had a crossover and it had six different titles, you had to read, Uncanny 305 and then X-Men 7 and then X Factor 34. And then you'd cycle through that and then you'd go back again to Uncanny X-Men number 306 and on and on. And when I was charged with coming up with Age of Apocalypse, I was like, let's do something different. Let's do a X-Men Alpha and an X-Men Omega. And we called all the writers together and we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to do the traditional crossover. We're going to do a crossover where this is where we start and this is where we end up. And where we end up is on this bridge uh, where the Age of Apocalypse is going to come to an end. And so whatever you want to do in your four issues, you should do them. And they were like, well, wait a minute. You can't just tell us to, like, what happens in it. I go, whatever you want to happen in it. All you need to do is to make sure that these characters are alive and they're on the bridge in Age of Apocalypse Omega. And they really got angry at first. They go, no, no, you can't do it. You can't just throw this into the. I go, look, this is an opportunity. I'm not saying you have to do this and this and this because we're doing this and this and this and then this and this issue comes around and you do it all over again. I said, and then they go, well, what order are they going to read them though? I go, they're going to read Generation X 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if they don't read X Factor, you don't lose anything. But they're going to want to read all of them because all of them are going to be so exciting. And then they're like, well, okay. And I think that's why you get some of the best writing out of everybody during Age of Apocalypse, because the freedom that they got to tell these stories as opposed to tell a chapter in a story was, I mean, John Francis Moore's Factor X was, I mean,
Factor X, yes.
amazing, you know? And so But I just wanted to be clear that, like, until then, I was kind of just feeling my way around the X-Men offices. And it's funny because to me, when I think of Executioner Song, two
Yes.
things. One was the speech that he delivered in Central Park just before he got shot.
Very memorable speech. Very memorable speech.
Thank you. And then the other thing I remember was the after Age of Apocalypse when he could walk for another hour and Jubilee was like, let's go rollerblading. And she sends him into the pond and then he tries to make his way back to the wheelchair, but he can't quite do it. And then Jubilee goes and throws his hand. I mean, like, to me, that was the stuff that I most liked. I could do fights and I could do, plotting out events. But to me, the things I liked most were the issues where you get like kind of teared up and like, you know, those were my favorite.
Okay, if I ask you in a simple way, just for the understanding of my own understanding as well as for my viewers and the community that's out there, while you were involved with X-Men book, your most important direction, if you will, or the project that you led was Age of Apocalypse. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say that was what I would say is that was the first event. And then eventually Fabian wandered off to do other things. And then the events like Operation Zero Tolerance, that was all me. And, like once Fabian was on, there are things that I did, certainly, Born, Onslaught. But until Age of Apocalypse, that was the first time where you actually saw my fingerprints all over a story.
I see. Because obviously, this is a story from the bullpen, straight out of the bullpen. And this is something really valuable for us to know. And to each and every one of you who was maybe trying to recollect which Generation X issue Mr. Scott Lobdell is talking about, this is the one, the chromium cover. I still have it in mint condition with me. And the prelude to the Generation X #1, the Phalanx Covenant. My God, I just loved it. I mean, it's a bit difficult for me to accept new superheroes who don't have much of a history other than the fact that, like, for example, we had Cannonball's sister being part of Generation X or something like that. But the way they were built up in this Phalanx crossover event, I mean, to this day, it remains one of my most favorite of what you and your team were able to accomplish. But I want to ask you that if you can, you have clarified one very important bit, and I want to discuss some more things about Age of Apocalypse and Onslaught that came after. But before I go into that, I actually want you to share some interesting things that happened during the 30th anniversary of X-Men. Because this was not a small feat on its own. And the amount of stories that were published, and especially when I talk about your story, which started from X-Men #300, when we came across the fact that Ilyana Rasputin is dying of the legacy virus. And then her funeral takes place in X-Men 304. And Magneto exploits that situation to his advantage, the betrayal and all that. I mean, there is so much drama, but relatable drama that's happening there. I mean, take us through that phase of your life.
I think that to me, the X-Men, I remember reading Uncanny, the circus issue, where, Banshee is being a carnival barker on the cover, and you see Nightcrawler as a trapeze artist, and what's his name, Colossus as this strong guy. And that issue, you went in, and all of a sudden, like the X-Men were prisoners of Magneto, and then they escaped and they fell to Earth, and they were in the Savage Land, and then they were in Japan, and then they went to uh, Canada and met Alpha Play. It was like, like that spate of issues there was just like kaboom, 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 kaboom. It was, and at the time it was Chris and John, and they were firing on, all eight cylinders. They were just like, you were always, always, always surprised. The next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And I think what we wanted to do was, like over the years, and this is no slam against Chris, is over the years you have your favorites. So you don't want to do anything to them, so your team just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because you don't want to write anybody out, you know.
Right.
And if you don't want to write anybody out, then you don't really want anything to happen to them. You just want them to be, on the shelf for whenever you need them.
Right.
And so when we got there, we talked about the fact like that was a really exciting time when you would open up the next issue and you had no idea what was just about to slam you in the face. And I think that that's what we tried to go back and recapture. Fabian will tell you this. I'm not trying to say anything disparaging, but Fabian and I had two entirely different ways of approaching our X-Men work. If you sat down with Fabian, he could tell you what happens for the next 5 years. He'd have a chart and he'd be like, well, Betsy's going to do this, and then she's going to become this character, and Wolverine's going to do that. And he had it all plotted out for like years ahead of time. I would sit down and they'd be like, oh my God, that was so cool. What happened at the end of that issue? That was amazing. So what happens next? Like, oh no, I'll tell you as soon as I sit down to write it. They're like, and Fabian be like, come on, you can't write that way. And I go, if I can surprise myself, then I can surprise the audience. And so that was how I thought of things. And it would drive Fabian right up the wall because he was like, you can plan it. I go, you can plan what you're having for dinner that night, but you don't know if your taxi cab is going to hit a horse in the park and suddenly you can't make it to the restaurant. And then you're arrested as a witness to this accident. And you don't know. All you have is your basic idea. I'm going to dinner tonight with my friends. You don't know what's going to happen. You know there's going to be a bar fight. Somebody's going to get hurt. And so in that way, you just don't know. And that's what a lot of my writing came from. And I will tell you something to disappoint you. You're going to be very sad, but I'm going to tell you the truth because we're friends now. You reference Magneto, Wolverine shutting down Magneto's mind,
Professor Xavier. Professor X.
Professor X shutting down Magneto's mind.
Yes.
How later on it was interesting because then you saw that they were trapped in Xavier's mind, that he didn't shut it down as much as he took Magneto's brain into his own, like his mind into his own. But what happens is if you look at it from your point of view, that was pretty ambitious that from the time he got pulled into Magneto's pulled into Charles's mind all the way up to Onslaught.
Yes.
You look, holy shit, that is some planning. That's like John Hickman level planning. That took years to get this story told. That was amazing. But the truth is that none of that is actually real in the sense, like, I'll give you an example,
Sure.
is after Age of Apocalypse, we all sat around and we said, Bob and the editors were like, okay, this was kind of a big chore and you guys all did good. So if you could do one story, what would you do? And Warren Ellis is like, well, I know what I want to do, but they won't let me do it. And it's like, well, what is it? And he goes, I want Excalibur to sit around a bar and just get drunk. And it's
Okay.
like, go ahead, go do that. So then it came my turn, and I said, I want to have the X-Men sitting around, and there's this like loud whistling sound, and boom, and they run out, and there's Juggernaut, and he's skid like 5 miles, and he's slammed into a tree. And the X-Men run up, and they go, "What happened?" He just says, "Onslaught." They're at the table. They go, "Oh my God, that's okay. That's really cool. You have to do that. Who's Onslaught?" I know, I have no idea, but I just think it would be so cool. Like somebody beat up Juggernaut. How cool is that? And they're like, okay, if that's what you're going to do. So I did that issue. And then about a month after it came out, one of the editors went to Bob and said, hey, you had somebody beat up Juggernaut. He's like one of the strongest characters we have. And then it just says Onslaught. Like, you can't do that. You have to explain who Onslaught is.
Right.
Goes, oh, okay. So he went to me and he said, Scott, yeah, the other editors are complaining. You have to explain who Onslaught is. I go, nah. I said, I don't really. I said, I don't know who he is and I don't really care. Like maybe today, we might need him for something. But other than that, I'm not, I don't have any interest in who Onslaught is. So a few months go by and they start to talk about Heroes Reborn and how there has to be like these two separate universes.
Right.
And we kept going back and forth, like who could the villain could separate the Avengers and the X-Men into two different universes. And we're like, well, it's not Kingpin, it's not Doctor Octopus, it's not Doctor Doom because he had just been used for something. It wasn't Apocalypse. It wasn't. And all of a sudden, I'm at home one day and I'm like, oh my God. And I came into the office. I go, Onslaught could do it. And they go, how do you know Onslaught could do it? I go, because he beat up Juggernaut. He's got how powerful is this guy? So they're like, well, okay, well, who is Onslaught? And I was like, well, presumably he's making the Avengers go away. So he's focusing on the X-Men. So it should be X-Men driving the story. And then I forget how, but I think Wade was on the book, Mark Wade was on the book for a while, and we were plotting out who Onslaught was. And then, well, what if Onslaught is the two of them combined? I go, well, when did that happen? Like, how could they be combined? And then it's like, oh, all that time ago, when Xavier shut down Magneto, he
Yeah,
didn't shut him down inside, and he's been corrupted this whole time. Like he thinks he's saving Magneto when Magneto is really corrupting Xavier,
ex-
and the two of them have formed this character who is Onslaught, who's unstoppable. The two most powerful mutants in all of comic books are like have become this singular entity. So then it's like, okay, well, if you think about it, when was the first time Onslaught was mentioned? It was when Juggernaut got beat up, and who's Juggernaut? Is Xavier's stepbrother who tormented him. So if Onslaught was going to lash out at anybody, who's the first person he would lash out on? Well, 6 months, a year later, it turned out it was,
Xavier all along.
yeah, well, it would turn out that it was Juggernaut was, yeah, lashed out at by Magneto. I mean, by Xavier. So again, you look at it and you go, oh my God, that is some class A Hickman pre laying down all the seeds and going back and picking them up later. But that was really just me and how my brain worked. Like I was always throwing things out, going, "Oh, that's interesting. I'll just leave that there and I'll come and get it later." And so there was no when you say like what the plan was for the 30th issue or 30th anniversary,
Yeah.
I'd have to very little planning as much as there was taking advantage of what was there, you know. So, but and Fabian will tell you that that's insane and the most batshit way to work, but it works for me.
I actually both represent two phases of my life. One is before 2017 and the other is after 2017. Before 2017, I was like Fabian, things planned out. I have to finish my degree by this year. I have to start my job. When I'm 25, I have to be full-time employed. By 28, 29, I have to be married. This was how I used to think. Post 2017, when I got into this content creation startup which focuses on superheroes, I became you, taking things day by day, day by day, day by day. But for me, and I'm sure for all the viewers who are actually watching this interview, this is a huge shock because all this time when we were reading, because these crossover events are so close to me at least that I have read them more, each crossover more than 20 times at least.
Which was your favorite?
You're asking a very tough question, Mr. Lobdell, because if I have
Mine
to choose, for me, Fatal Attractions is number one, but not without a tie.
to Age of Apocalypse.
Yes.
See, it's funny is that they were big stories and they were getting bigger and bigger. And it was funny because at the end of Heroes Reborn, I had kind of started to check out, and I never really said this in public before, but I'm going to say it now. Is that what happened was halfway through Heroes Reborn, I'm sorry, I scripted 5 of the top 10 comics, and then I plotted 3 others. So I was responsible for 8 of the top 10 comic books that month. And I just remember being so depressed because I'm like, what's my goal to do do like 10 of 10, like what, like where, like where's the next mountain to climb, because that wasn't it. And so I, so we were doing the age of, we were doing, and I was scheduled to do Fantastic Four, and it was really fun, those three issues. All these writers who were not necessarily the X-Men writers, they were from everywhere, Spider-Man, whatever. And they came across this idea that here's what we'll do. We'll make Franklin have to choose between his family and destroying this universe, the Heroes Return universe. So
Right.
he gets it back, but he destroys the universe. How cool is that? Everybody's like, oh my God, that's so great. And I raised my hand. I said, Marvel used to be the world outside your window. It was like, we weren't in Metropolis. We were in Manhattan. We weren't in Gotham City. We were in Los Angeles or whatever it was. And I said, now we're talking about a 3-year-old choosing between his family and a universe. I said, what stories are we telling now? Like, where's the metaphor even for a 3-year-old that has to make a choice like that? It doesn't exist. It was like, to me, it was a false choice. It was a plot. It was a plot decision. It wasn't a character decision. Um, and so as I went on, like if you look at Operation Zero Tolerance, Operation Zero probably like the smallest crossover ever. Not so, but because it was Bobby and Cecilia and Sabra and I forget who else, but it was really small, And like I remember saying, I'm so tired of, like it used to be. I have a vague recollection of the X-Men when it was Kirby and Stan, where they had to get somewhere, and the only way to get there was in a station wagon.
Right.
And it was like, what the heck? You had the Avengers, and they were flying around in a Quinjet, and the X-Men had a station wagon that they had to borrow from somebody. To me, even at the beginning of, when Chris and everybody took on the X-Men, it was hard. Like, there's a difference between being the X-Men and being the Avengers. The Avengers had love. They had a mansion that everybody could see. You could go knock on their front door. Whereas the X-Men were hidden and they didn't have the resources. They didn't have Tony Stark's money. They didn't have, but then over the years, suddenly the X-Men had a healer. If somebody was almost dead, they'd go to the Morlocks and he would fix you up. They had they had their own Blackbird that would
Blackbird, yes.
world underneath the swimming pool. The swimming pool would open up and they'd be, and they just had everything. And I thought, oh my God, that's so boring, like, and so with Operation Zero Tolerance, my goal was to strip them back down to nothing and see who these characters were trying to save the world with absolutely no resources. And that's where the idea to Operation Zero started. Instead of like a big, I don't know, like any one of the big crossovers, Age of Bugs, whatever, where it was like, oh, we got to see what X Factor's doing and what Excalibur's doing and what Uncanny is doing, what X Force is doing, and what Generation X, New Mutants, and it was just big, 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 big. And with Operation Zero Tolerance, I wanted to be like, no, this is what we're seeing,
Right.
Bob and 3 other characters and Bastion chasing them. And I thought I felt that that's what I felt in a lot of ways that that would have been a good direction. Like I know even before I got there that I was not long of the X-Men because I was asked just to fill in the gap between whoever and Grant and Joe. So I knew I only had a bunch of issues. I do feel I feel like, you had me going in the direction of, shrinking. And then in the next issue, there are like 500 students at Xavier's, and one has fish eyes, and the other has the ability to fart under their arm. It was like, it just went in the total opposite direction. Even Joe had
This is
a mute.
E. This is E. E is for extinction phase of X-Men.
Was it? Yep. And what's his face? Joe Casey came in with like look at this rock star. He plays mutant music, and his all the kids' parents are mad because they don't like mutant music. And I'm like, what is mutant music? You know?
Okay. Mr. Lobdell, there is something very important you touched upon while you were taking us through. You mentioned the hero's reborn phase. You mentioned the story where Franklin had to choose between his family or the return of heroes into the mainstream universe of Marvel. One thing has always puzzled me that when X-Men and Marvel Universe Onslaught story, it was going really well. Why was it decided to take it in a direction whereby we would see, this thing where Doctor Doom and Avengers and the Fantastic Four end up in a pocket universe altogether, and then basically these heroes are getting relaunched and stuff and everything. I mean, was there some kind of, how should I say, uh, a paralysis when it came to the Avengers storytelling, that this is how the editorial, that okay, let's use this X-Men crossover event, make it like more Marvel-esque instead of just X-Men, and then relaunch these characters? Because
To answer your question, it was actually the opposite of what you gleaned. What happened was the after Age of Apocalypse, the X-Men sales and the rest of the Marvel Universe sales were just untenable, and so unbeknownst to anyone, I believe even Bob Harris will tell you, but maybe I have to ask him this interesting question. But unbeknownst to everyone, the president of the company went to Image, specifically Jim and Rob, and said, "We want to pay you guys to reimagine the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, the Avengers, who else? Captain America,
Captain America and Hulk, Avengers, Captain America and Hulk."
part of Iron Man, yes, but it was 4 titles. But either way, they said, "We are going to pay you to create. We're we're going to license our characters to you guys for a year and see how it goes." Came back and they announced to the editors who were on the books, in not so many words, they said, "You guys have been so bad and you've made so many boring decisions with these characters that we're going to pay Jim and Rob to reimagine the characters." And everybody's really angry because they were like, "We could fix these characters." And the question is, well, if you could, why didn't you? You know, like, why are these books not selling? And so then essentially the decision was made that if they did just an Avengers crossover, at the time no one would care because no one was reading the Avengers. They weren't reading the Avengers, they weren't reading Fantastic Four, they weren't reading Captain America. These were all just books that were just going underwater. And so they said, well, if we just do an Avengers crossover, no one's going to care. So then it was like, okay, well, what if it's an X-Men? What if it's an X-Men, huge X-Men Avengers event that ended with the Avengers being shunted off into their own dimension, which would allow the Image guys to reimagine the characters in a way that doesn't impact the regular ongoing books.
Right, right.
First. And so that's what happened, and that's when they decided. And initially, they called for 10, I believe it's 10 issues, 12 issues, and probably if there wasn't so much animosity on the part of everybody that worked at Marvel, they probably would have been better off just, say, okay, let's do another year, or let's do a year and have them come back. And but like, I mean, I think the fans liked it. The fans seemed to like the Heroes Reborn stories.
Yeah.
And really the difference was the Heroes Reborn stories than the Marvel Knight stories that followed them, except the Marvel Knight stories were in continuity, but they were just
Yes.
like, we're just going to look at it with a fresh set of eyes. So it wasn't that they were like, do you see the difference?
I do see the difference now, and especially if I have to now, based on what I have learned, that if I have to judge Marvel's actions, where they wanted basically to hire some very talented individuals to reimagine some of their flagship characters, Heroes Reborn, yes, it has its fan base, very good stories. But if I have to choose, I would always prefer the Marvel Knights. And I guess you solved this mystery for me then, because I have this trading card of Mr. Fantastic from the Onslaught series. And behind it, Jim
Sure,
Lee. Yeah. Basically, building up the Heroes Reborn thing that was about to follow from the events of Onslaught. But here's one question that there is one other question that I always wondered because, and I'm glad you touched on this. So you have been part of Marvel Comics where the Heroes Reborn thing happens, and then while you ended Ages of Apocalypse crossover event, we see Marvel surviving bankruptcy and entering the Marvel Knights era. Why is it that we don't find much of Scott Lobdell in that particular very important phase of comics? And instead, after that, correct me if I'm wrong, I see the major breakthrough coming into your career would be that one fine day I'm on the website of DC Comics, and next thing you know, I see your picture there, and it's being announced that you have joined DC Comics and you are going to be writing some uh, A-list titles, namely the Red Hood and the Outlaws, Teen Titans, and Superman.
sure.
Yeah. So if you can take us through that, I mean, because like not having you or Larry Hama, for example, or Peter David, for example, during the Marvel Knights time was quite surprising.
Well, I mean, I think even to this day, it's like, I was representative. I was essentially the embodiment of Miss Marvel, you know?
Right.
And when the new guys came in, I think they were like, well, we're going to fix things. So if you're going to fix things, what's the first thing you're going to do? You know?
Take out the old order.
Yeah. And so that's what they did. I didn't mind because I had already, started to make my way to Hollywood. So I was fine with it. Um, And if you look really closely, when Onslaught happened,
Mhm.
I asked to do Fantastic Four for Heroes Reborn, Return rather. And my feeling was, I would say to Bob, we'd have these conversations, and I say, honestly, I think the best thing you could do is take me off of the X-Men and let me see what I can do with the rest of the Marvel Universe. And so I was like, I would love to do Fantastic Four. He goes, okay, well, you can do Fantastic Four, but you can't leave the X-Men. And I said, okay. And that's what I was doing for a bit. But my feeling at the time was always, I never wanted to grow up to be the guy who, like Chris or like Peter David or like other creators, I didn't want to be that guy that you like pulled away from the computer.
Mhm.
Like you're here and they're backing you up, and you're like, wait, I have one more X-Men story to tell.
Okay. Like you didn't want it to be glued with uh, a particular title, if you will.
Yeah, and plus, like with the X-Men, it's like, like I don't, like Chris can tell you to this day what Storm had for breakfast this morning. If you called him up and say, hey, what did Storm have for breakfast? He'd be like, oh, she had pancake. Whereas with me, I very, very, very rarely thought about the X-Men unless I was sitting down in front of the computer, you know, and that was it. And I would write that issue, and then whatever happened in the next issue, or because again, like I wasn't a planner, and I wasn't somebody that was immersed in it, you know. So, uh, so I don't know, but I think that again, I think that's what kept me fresh. Like if you really look, one of the rules that I had for myself was I always say to this day, I say, show me the next thing, not the last thing. I don't want to see the last thing. I want to see the next thing. Like sometimes people will show me character designs and they go, look, he has all these pockets. Like I go, we've seen the pockets. Let's see the next thing. What's the next thing? Show me the next thing. I mean, when you look at Generation X, like, Generation X didn't come out in the black and yellow outfits. They came out in these weird,
Red and yellow.
yeah, the swirly knee pads. And it's like, what? And I loved it. It was like, oh my God, that's something I haven't seen before. Similarly, my rule at the time of writing the X-Men was I didn't want. They asked me to do New Mutants, and I said, "Let me think about it." And then he came back, and I pitched him Generation X, and they were like, "That's a great name, but what about New Mutants?" So we've already seen the New Mutants several times. Let's see something else. I don't want to see the Sentinels. I want to see the Phalanx. I don't want to see uh, the Hellfire Club. I want to see the Upstarts. I don't want to see the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. I want to see the Acolytes. Like I want to see the next thing, not the last thing, the next thing. And invariably, like when I left the first time from the X-Men, the very first issue after I left, they're like, "Oh, guess who's back? Kitty and Nightcrawler and Colossus, and they're back." And it's like, okay, so we took a giant step backwards. Yay! Who wants to see that? And yeah, I mean, so that's what I was. So my feeling was always like, what's the next thing? I don't want to see you know, I don't want to see Magneto in New Mutants #1. I want to see M Plate. You know, so
Right.
um, I didn't even when I was pitching Generation X, it was like, okay, well, use Cable or use Xavier or what about Scott? And I go, we've seen that already. How about Banshee? Banshee? Oh, that's an interesting choice. Why would you want Banshee? Well, because he was a cop, and it'd be cool if he had a point of view where he's like, I'm not about training new X-Men. I'm about making sure these kids know how to survive being mutants in today's world." And then it was like, does he have enough edge? It's like, well, no, but if he was teamed up with Emma Frost, that would be awesome. Yeah, then I was like, what? So um but
When you mentioned that, like, your approach is always like, don't show me the last thing, show me the next thing. And yet, we also find you taking a deep dive into the origins of Cable with the Adventures of Cyclops and Jean Grey limited series. And that's a bit confusing in a way that Cable's origin from his infancy was untouched since the days of X Factor. And then here we are revisiting something that was not touched upon for many years. And then you provided a much deeper understanding about the history of the Askani sun.
but having said that, I'll tell you why it's not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction because I didn't have anything to do with Cable really up until Cyclops and Phoenix #1. Happened was is I didn't get the character. I didn't necessarily like the character at the time. I didn't understand who Strife was. It was decided that this was going to be on the schedule. That it was going to be a big Cable centric story about Cable's origin. And I Bob came to me and said, "Here's the problem, Scott, is that Cable, it seems very clear that Scott let his son go into the future with this techno-organic virus who became Strife and murdered millions of people. And he had a clone named Cable who came back in time to stop it. But he said the thing that I keep bumping up against is that means that Scott is directly responsible for uh, sending this Hitler into the future to kill millions of people. Like, how do you get around that? Like, how do you save Scott? How do you save Scott's personality by having him say, "Oh, here, take this baby and bring it into the future and kill millions?"
Right.
So I said, to me, the only difference between baby Cyclops and baby Cable and baby Strife is that who raised them. And what we find out is that in this story, I proposed, what if Scott and Jean are on their honeymoon? They
Mhm.
get zapped, or, Mother Scotty shows up and says, "You guys are, you have to raise your kid.
Right.
Otherwise, it turn out to be Strife." So they actually have the actual Nathan as Cable, who they raise. And so the only reason that Cable didn't become Strife is because he became Cable because he was being raised by his loving parents, even if he didn't realize it at the time. So pretty much, I didn't do a deep dive, which is what you said. It's more like I was given a blank slate and said, you just have to make sure that that Cable, who everybody loves, is not ruined by having him be the clone of this guy who killed everybody. And that was all that was presented to me. Everything else, like Scott and or Slim and Red, and prelates, and the very first time we see them in a bar, and it's like these udders are hanging down from the ceiling, and it turns out they drink sour milk because of the alcohol content in it. I mean, everything else, the Clan Ascani, all that stuff was just so that was no deep diving. That was me building from yeah, pretty much from scratch. From like they were all set to announce that Nathan was the real. That series was supposed to be about the reveal that Nathan was Strife and that Cable was a clone of Nathan.
Nathan.
That's what was gonna be announced, and then I went in and I was like, no, I don't think that's the case. I think like it's the love of the parents for their child that spanned across time and space and whatever alternate realities may or may not have been. And that's what that story is. And again, it's a huge tapestry, but it's a really, really small story about Scott and Jean who loved their only begotten son so much that they were lost 10 years of their lives raising him to be the person that Cable is, you know. So
Important story. Very important story.
and again, so it's funny that you say that I deep dive because I really didn't. I just kind of made up a whole bunch of stuff.
It's the thing is, I mean, like when for me, this interview has probably been one of the most pleasantly surprising in a way because it shows, there is this perception that we build when we read someone's work, when we read someone's stories. And then next thing you know, what makes it even more exciting is the fact that what our expectations were that okay, this might have happened in the bullpen, or this was being thought of, or this may have been the creative direction. And next thing you know, we tend to find reality completely on a different course, if you will. And I just want to say something. This is just a personal observation while I was listening to you. You mentioned that like you are not someone who is gets immersed with a particular character. You always wanted to write different characters, but Bob always insisted that okay, you can write any other character you want, but you cannot leave X-Men. Whereas there are some individuals who, and I'm really glad you gave a very good example because Chris Claremont, when I watch him, when we watch his interview, he's talking about X-Men as if they are his own flesh and blood, if you will. Are you the X-Men universe's Steve Ditko, if you will, who is not immersed with the characters? You get the characters, you go day by day, you think through, you don't go for the last thing, you go for the next thing, and you deliver something really fresh.
I don't know Steve's career well enough to know. I mean, I know that he, at the height of the '90s, when we were making god awful amount of money, they offered him, I don't know, like $1 million to do Spider-Man. He was like, no, not interested. I have no connection to that character. And that's when they said, well, how do you feel about doing Speedball? He goes, oh, that's interesting. That's why you end up doing Speedball instead of Spider-Man. But like literally, Steve was such a singular entity that literally they offered him $1 million or maybe even more to come back and do Spider-Man at some point, and he just was not interested. So God bless him.
That's the thing. I mean, like if I compare Steve Ditko with Stan Lee, for example, and Stan is always talking about each and every Marvel character that was from the Marvel Age or the Bronze Age or the Copper Age. Okay, he loves each and every character, just like Chris Claremont loves each and every X-Men. But Steve is not, we don't, I never came across, because obviously Steve was a very private individual. And whatever we have learned from Jonathan Ross's documentary, some other documentaries, some from his children, if you will, he was, I mean, I used to think that he would love Spider-Man, he would love Doctor Strange. And talking to you, I mean, it just came into my mind. I mean, you just reminded me of Steve Ditko.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know him well enough to know, but I do, like I say, it's, every once in a while people will say, hey, if you could write the X-Men again, what would, and I'd be like, just that part of the sentence makes me go, I mean, I would, I'll tell you this story. I don't know if you know, but when I broke in, my goal was to topple the X-Men with whatever I was working on. And I got Alpha Flight at one point, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to make Alpha Flight the best fucking book. It's going to knock the X-Men right off the, front of the table. Like the Olympic things where like they're at the
Yeah,
three different levels.
yeah.
Yeah, I knocked them off. And then 3 months into it, I got the X-Men. So it was like, okay, I can't very well knock them off. But having said that, my goal was just to be the best comic book writer that I could be. And if that meant, writing the Defenders or something, sure, I'll do my best. I'll do the best Defenders. But I remember walking with a friend of mine, Mark Powers, who was in the editorial offices, and we had just found out that John was talking about quitting after Chris
John Byrne.
Byrne, yeah, because he wanted 2 weeks to do every issue, and he only had like 2 days most of the time, a
Right,
script.
right.
And so he put his foot down. And I remember we were walking on an escalator at this mall in a few blocks from Marvel. I go, that is crazy. I said, now who are they going to get to take John and Chris's place? That's crazy. And Mark goes, you. I go, me? I said, me. I write, like I've written Alpha Flight, I've written Excalibur. I wrote 80-page stories. I said, why would they pick me? He goes, well, you're just, you're the best that we have. Like, you're the best writer that Marvel has right now. And I said, well, thanks. And then when I don't know, maybe it couldn't have been too much long later, but I don't know if you know this story, but I was, if you read enough press, they'll tell you that the reason why I got the X-Men is because I was Bob's best friend in high school.
Okay, that I never came across, by the way.
Okay, yeah, I've come across that many times. And the funny thing is that before I got the X-Men, I had like maybe 4 sentences worth of conversation with Bob Harris. And what happened is we were in the I was leaving the bathroom and he was coming in, and I had started this 6-part Beast story. And halfway through it, he said he didn't want the story to happen and it had to change. And so he told my editor that. And then we were in the bathroom at the same time. I said, listen, not for nothing. I said, but I think that's really unfair. Like, you approved the story and then I started it, and now you're like cutting it off at the knees. Because, well, it doesn't have to be fair. It's what it is.
Ah,
And I didn't say fuck you, and he didn't say fuck you, but it was like, and so I would tell people, I said, oh yeah, I just had words with Bob Harris, and they go, why would you do that? He's the editor. I go, what do I give a flaming fuck about the X-Men for? I mean, like Chris has been writing it for 17 years. He'll write it for another 17 years. I'm not writing the X-Men. Why the fuck do I care what Bob Harris thinks about anything? And then 3 weeks later, I was getting ready for the Marvel Christmas party, and I was in Terry's office, my editor's office, writing. And this was around like 6 o'clock at night. And Bob comes into the office and he goes, Scott, walk with me. I'm like, okay. And so we walked to his office, and he has 22 pages of faxes. And it was a thermal paper,
right.
where when it would come off the fax machine, it would like curl up, you know.
Yes.
So he puts it down on the thing and he spreads it out and he goes, 22 pages in 24 hours. Can you do it? And I said, sure. And in my head, I'm thinking, sure, because if I do it and it comes out great, people go, holy shit, look what he did. And if I do it and it comes back horrible, people go, he had 24 hours to do an issue. Like, what do you expect? He did his best. The book made it to the printers on time. But as it was, I was fortunate because I wrote it and everybody loved it. And then
Which issue was this, Mr. Lobdell?
286.
Uncanny X-Men 286.
Yeah, that was my first X-Men issue. And then John was, holding out for, well, they're not going to be able to move ahead without me. And in the meantime, they gave me X-Men 6. Then they
Yes.
gave me 385. And then before you know it, I was the X-Men writer. And that was it. And to this day, they never said, hey, you're going to be the X-Men writer. They just said, what do you think about should happen in the next issue? 5 years in, I'm like, hey, I guess I'm the X-Men writer. But it was funny because, like I say, I read it all the time. I read people go like, oh, Scott Lobdell and Bob Harris are best friends. Bob and I have a great working relationship. I can't tell you his kids' names. I've never been to his house. He's never been to my house. We don't go to dinner. We don't, send birthday cards. We don't, he is a guy that I worked with at Marvel that we got along really well. And then later on at DC. And has a friendship developed over the years? Probably, yeah. I love Bob Harris, but this notion that somehow I got to work on the X-Men because we were best friends in high school. It wasn't that. It was just purely an act of desperation on Bob's part. So, in
I
fact, what
want
happened?
I want to ask a controversial question, and that controversy because you were there at the time when Chris Claremont had left the X-Men books, and then he would come back in early 2000s to write Extreme X-Men.
Mhm.
Uh, to my knowledge, from what I was able to get, was that he had disagreement with Bob Harris, where I believe that Bob wanted to write Jim Lee's name over Chris Claremont or before Chris Claremont's name, because according to him, it was the art that was basically making people go crazy. And Jim Lee's art, everybody loves it, but I want to know from someone who has been part of the X-Men, who has worked with Bob Harris, who has worked with Chris Claremont, where is the truth in all of this?
The truth is, I can't tell you it's a lie because maybe it was said, but I can't imagine a scenario where Bob would ever change the order of credits, which has always been written by and, da da da. And the same way that Spider-Man didn't become Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man, even though he was writing and drawing it, I believe.
Yes, he did that.
Or,
He did
you
that.
know, Liefeld's X-Force, it wasn't Will Portasio's Uncanny. So I can't imagine that's just not something Bob would have done. I think here's the truth, and I'm not trying to besmirch Chris because he's clearly a genius and he's added so much to comic books in general, let alone the X-Men. Like I once picked up an award for Rogue being a number one character through Wizard or something. And I said, I can't, I said, I accept this award, but I accept it on behalf of Chris because if Chris hadn't come along and written the X-Men, comic books probably would have died out in the, it was really it was happening and it was astounding, and but having said that, Chris has this or had, I shouldn't say have because I haven't read it lately, but he would write a page and the page would be Storm lands and discovers that her tribe is angry at her because there's a drought because when she left for the X-Men, she no longer took care of her tribe in Africa.
Right.
So she understands her point, so she unleashes a monsoon and the waterfalls and everybody loves her and they all bow down before her and thank her for helping. Then in Germany, Nightcrawler is in disguise as he buys a ticket for the old circus that he was in. And then he goes into the circus and he sees that the elephants are being mistreated. So he bamps on top of the elephants and then he rides them out of the circus, liberating them. And it's like that's a page, like the Storm story and the Nightcrawler story were all one page. And you see over the years, some artists tried to get everything that Chris asked for into the page, but it's absurd. Like, no offense, I don't know how he never learned how many things fit in a page, but like Storm landing and her people being disappointed is her landing. Great, amazing shot. She lands, and then they step out of the shadows and they're angry, and they go, "Oh, what are they angry about?" Like that's a page, you know. Whereas he would have, you know, 12 panels of Storm and Nightcrawler on one page, and as over the years you'll see writers or artists really make an effort to try to give Chris everything he wanted. John left, Chris became more powerful, so then it was like, okay, I just got this script from Claremont, I have to put it all in. Jim got the pages and he was like, here's a shot of Storm landing, and then this is what I fit on the next page. And then he'd be like, there's no room for the Nightcrawler stuff. Out, you know, there's no, so he just started looking at it from a visual point of view. And the visual point of view is you want to see exciting storytelling going along with your exciting story. So Chris was getting angrier and angrier because the stuff he was writing was being tossed, and the book was becoming more and more popular because, where could you see art like that? It was like breathtaking. Probably not since Burn get to see, maybe Paul Smith, but Paul Smith was a little sedate. And then, Wills and Jim and Todd and Silvestri and Rob, and they're all sending their pages back and forth to you. And Rob's like, I turned Cable onto the side. And holy shit. And all they did was like fax each other. And this was even before JPEGs and stuff. They just fax each other stuff. And it became like, I can do it. I can outdo that. And like, look what Spider-Man did to, I'm sorry, look what Todd did to Spider-Man's webs. Like, what is that?
The spaghetti webbing.
What's that?
Spaghetti webbing.
And I was like, what am I looking at? That's so cool. And then Jim's like, I'm going to do a Cyclops, but I'm going to give him a visor. His hair is going to come out of his eye. But what? Like it was just this constant one-upmanship. And meanwhile, Chris is like, but I want to do the scene with whatever. So, I mean, no offense to Chris, but, you know, I like when I got the X-Men, those pages that I told you about for 286, they were pretty much done, but they were being drawn in San Diego, and Jim had like 10 people that were helping him. So all he'd have to do is draw like a Wolverine, and then somebody else would come in and put in the background. And it was like such dynamic background. You're like, oh my God, how can he do all this? Well, he couldn't do all that. So he got people who were helping him, and it was great. It worked, and it was lovely. When I would get a page, because suddenly I was putting out a book every 2 weeks, so I would get 20 pages, and it would be the issue where Wolverine meets Ghost Rider and they fight. And what's his name? Gambit's wife was in it, Belladonna, Introduction of Belladonna. I got these fax pages that would have a circle and 3 lines through it. Do you know what that is?
Wolverine slash.
It was a close up of Wolverine.
Right.
And then the next panel, there'd be a circle and like squiggle flames at the top. Do you know what that is?
Ghost Riders.
Ghost Rider's head. So
Right.
the two characters staring at each other,
Right.
and pull back, and in the middle of them is another circle with a shaded part here and a shaded part there, and then some hair in the middle. You know what that was? That was Rogue breaking them up.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then on the panel, we see them lunging at each other.
Right.
And is the circle with the 3 lines and the whatever and they would send it to me and they'd say, okay, here's the plot. And I go, I don't see a plot. I see a circle with 3 lines, and I guess that's Rogue. And there's 2 circles on the ground, so that must be Xavier,
Right.
you know, and that's what I was working with. So maybe it was because I was young and desperate, but I was like, okay. my job is to make a story out of these symbols. And then the symbols would come out, and people go, "Holy shit, that was a great story." And I'm like, "Thanks, I made it up." So, and Chris was older, and he had his way, and he got to do everything he wanted to do. And it just, like he wasn't nimble enough to say, "Okay, this is the future. Let me figure out how to move along with it." Instead, he was just angry that, he had lost his the sway that he had. So.
Understood.
And I think you would. I don't like to talk about Chris in the third person because we're never friends. Like we talk to each other now at conventions, but for the most part, he would just glare at me for the first, I don't know, 15 years I knew him. So I don't want to misrepresent it, but that's my understanding of the situation was that he just, at one point he threw his hat down and was like, "Well, it's me or Jim Lee, and you're Bob Harris. What do you do?" Oddly enough.
At least now we have some perspective from someone who was part of the bullpen at that particular moment in time, because unfortunately when we're talking about media, there's a lot of fluff and less of a substance that goes there. And for me it was quite like surprising, to say the least, when I came across this information for the very first time. And having said that, Bob Harris, because I was really fond of his stories that he wrote for the Avengers. This is a time when Andy Kubert was not drawing for the X-Men. He was actually making his case with the Avengers. And some of the stories I read that were written by Bob Harris. So I was like, I mean, why would a person who's himself is such a good writer, why would he not appreciate a legend like Chris Claremont? And now I understand that it's less to do about basically personalities coming into conflict. It's more about Chris was used to his way of doing things, and the new generation had new ideas, and which and this has been a battle going on since the beginning of time.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, even McCarthy broke up at some point.
yeah,
And this is that when I first started into comic books, you had to have a comic book done 6 months before it went to the printer.
right.
That was, they had to, nowadays they talk about ship dates like, oh, that ships out from the printers to the stores on this day and has to be there before then. It's like, we never talked about print dates. I mean, ship dates. That was like the comic books were long past out of our hands by the time it got to that point. And when you think about it, it was because the writer would write it, the penciler would pencil it. Once it's done penciled, they send it to the inker. He would need 30 days to ink it, a page a day. And then either they did the lettering, the color, so it would take months, and they would have it all lined up to go to the printers. I was working off of fax papers that were going to be at the printers in 2 weeks. I mean, and so that just became like, imagine you're somebody who, gets art and you have, 4 weeks to turn it in, and you wake up every morning, you go, oh, this, and I think this, and I can add that. And meanwhile, that's all gone. It's like a big fucking tidal wave of technology just came and, you know, it's not hard to. Nowadays, if somebody, like, even if a producer is like, oh, Scott, you need to turn in that script. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm almost done. In the old days, you can get away with almost done because then you were done and then you'd send it. And then after about a week, they go, oh, it didn't show up. And meanwhile, you're writing furiously. And then you go, oh, it didn't show up. Let me send it out now. Okay. And then uh, like, oh, we didn't get, oh, let me check the FedEx number. Meanwhile, you're like writing furiously. Whereas nowadays, if they say, well, just send me what you have, like if
You don't have an escape route.
yeah, I'd have to send you the PDF of what I have. And so similarly, technology changed all that about comic books, and I dare say that there are people that weren't ready for it.
Okay.
And I was just time, and stand-up comedy means that you don't get to you sort of have to go with what you have when you're on stage. You
Right.
can't then it gets a mediocre laugh, and then you tell another joke, then you go, you know what, can I go back? Let's go back and I'll tell that other joke and we'll see if I can make it funnier. Like that's and when you're writing and the book has to be done overnight, you just got to go with your instinct. So Which really, if you look at the books back then and you understand that I was writing it, like overnight, they're pretty astounding achievements at the time. So I have to say.
Yeah,
But then when the
they,
image guy another built in more of a
before we move on to your career at DC Comics,
I hope I'm not disillusioning you about all the exciting things about the 90s.
no, you're not, because in the end, I'm not someone who is looking out for clickbaits or juicy, sexy, sexed up information.
And I'm not,
What I am looking for and what I am actually trying to bring to my community is the fact that they need to understand and appreciate not just the work, the output that comes out, but also the process that goes behind it. And unfortunately, the part of the world we live in, most of us are the children of perfectionist parents. So it's like, this is how it is. This is the only path to success. If you don't do X, Y, and Z followed by 1, 2, and 3, you will be doomed. And if you fail, then there's no coming back. So, what happens is that there are a lot of aspiring young talent here in Saudi Arabia. They want to write their own comics. They want to be comic book artists. And the problem is that what happens is that if they are not exposed to the sort of information, the first-hand information from people who were part of the most important events in comic book history, then at least they will get some hope that, okay, I might not be someone like who does long-term planning. I go day by day. So I can look at Scott Lobdell's example, and he was able to deliver despite having an approach which was a lot of the times in conflict with his colleague, Fabian Lechanza. But at the end of the day, both of them made their mark when it came to the X-Men universe in the 90s and contributed greatly to the X-Men mania of the 90s.
yeah, I think it would be fair to say that I left a mark and Fabian left a scar.
Can you please repeat that?
Oh, I said I think I left a mark and Fabian left a scar. Just kidding, Fabian. You know I love you.
I hope I get the opportunity to interview Mr. Fabian Nachanza one day. I want to ask a question about, and this is like straight fire round. Before I move to your career at DC Comics and what you've been doing with Netflix recently, uh, if who is favorite colleague to work with when you were writing books for the X-Men back in the 90s?
And it's hard to say, but if I had to, I mean, I was very fortunate because I got to work with the best, you know. I will have to say I loved the energy that Joe, Matt, and I had. It was he would push me and I'd push back and he'd push me and we'd push back. We just had so much fun. I remember,
Loretta.
yeah, Joe Madureira. I remember the scene in X-Men Phalanx Covenant where Banshee goes up to the wall unit and he's like, plug me into Storm. And it's like, Storm is not in the building. He goes, well, it's just plug me into Bishop and Gambit. And they're like, Bishop and Gambit are not in the building. And he was just talking to them. So he says, Cerebro, who is in the building? And it's like, just you. And that's when he realizes that he's there with the Phalanx. And he's like, holy fuck.
Yes.
But when I looked at that page, the editors always used to tell me, oh, you got to use the Caption-O-Matic 3000, which is that, like, if there's a page that it's empty, you have to put in captions and make it, bigger and more reading and stuff. And I would do that, and I found a way to do that. That made it interesting for me. But when I started working with Joe, like, I looked at that page and I'm like, it's all right there. Like, Joe put it in, Sean's face. Like, what an amazing scene. They said, you got to add more words to it. I go, no, I don't. I said, it's all. Like, Joe, look what he did. And and that really changed. my writing a lot because then I was like, there's a long period of time where I just started treating comic book pages like movie pages. I didn't have narration, I didn't have thought balloons, I only had special effects. And you see that really um, front and center in X-Men Wildcats, the first issue with Travis. It was like you'll see there's no captioning. There's only identifying where they are. And I always was like you take guys like Joe and you take guys like Travis, and you're like, it's like you're watching a movie, and so I tried to treat it like a movie. And so there's that. And then Chris Bacella, when I was trying to enlist Chris, he said, no, I don't want to work on the X-Men because I don't draw like Jim Lee.
Right.
Course, there's so many people drawing like Jim Lee. If I wanted to, I'd go out and get a Jim Lee clone. I wouldn't be bothering Chris Pachella. So he's like, well, Scott, he goes, I'll give you an example. Because I did an issue of Death where these two people are talking on a front stoop. And it was 2 pages of them talking on a front stoop. And I only showed their knees. So like when the one person says they turn away and I turned it in and they said, you have to redraw this. You can't do 2 pages of knees. And Chris, I said, my promise to you is that if you turn in 2 pages of knees, I'll write 2 pages of knees. And that was the deal we had. And I never asked him to redraw anything once. And two, he was also, he would do things like the Halloween issue where he would draw goblins all in the panels.
Right. Yeah.
And I would be that's interesting. So then I would write a story separate from the story that I wrote, with the Gen X kids, but also write a story about like the elves that are here, or, like one time they're on a plane and there's a plane crash, and Chris decided that Jubilee should have a bottle of bubbles that she was waving around before the plane crashed. And then as the plane's crashing, the bubbles are like taking over more and more of the art and da 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 da. And it was amazing. And he'd laugh. He goes, I thought you were going to make me redraw it. I go, no, I promised you that whatever you turned in, that I would write it. And so that was, and it's funny because people would say like, okay, Scott, you never write full script, but you must be writing full script with this. There's no way you guys are like that simpatico. I said, no, we are 100% that simpatico. Like so it was, so both of them stuck out as two really special relationships. So,
Okay. Next.
oh, that's your question.
Yeah, sorry. Next question. You're done with the answer for the previous one, so I can go for the next one. Okay. Of all the X-Men crossover events you were involved with, whether you were leading the project or you were part of the project, which one is your all-time favorite you're proud to talk about?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's a trick question because I'm not unproud of anything, but I don't know. How old are you?
45.
Okay. Do you have any kids?
Yes, I have two children. Boy,
Which one's your favorite?
who's my... You got me.
And you can hold up that stack of comic books and you can ask me which one is my favorite, and I'd give you the same answer. You know,
I think you,
I
you
don't,
said it beautifully.
I don't have kids, but I have 24 nieces and nephews, and
Oh,
I couldn't do my favorite one. They're all very special in their own way.
they're all very special in their own way. Beautiful, beautiful. Well said.
What's the most surprising thing I said?
The most surprising bit was realizing the fact that, you know, as I had said earlier, that when I'm reading your work, there is a certain perception that's building in my mind. I'm imagining things, okay? I'm like Professor Xavier. I'm traveling to New York in an astral plane and entering the Marvel Bulletin, and I'm trying to see Scott Lobdell on one side. I'm trying to see Bob Harris on the other side. And I'm like seeing that these guys are, like working in a very cohesive fashion whereby there is minimal conflict. And, they're like the 1970s New York Knicks where the sum is greater than the whole, as they were called. That's what I felt. Because what I have read consistently is the fact that these crossovers were not the works of a single individual. It was a team that was there. There was a team for Uncanny X-Men. There was a team for X-Men, Wolverine, Cable, X-Force, X-Factor, Excalibur. And Bob Harris was the man on top, supervising the editorial, if you will. So, it's like I would be thinking that, okay, this is, and one thing that I have read consistently, which you debunked in this session of the podcast, is the fact that people say that you were the main creative force in this phase of X-Men, starting with the Executioner song and going all the way to Ages of Apocalypse. But today, you were basically kind enough to shed information on the fact that the first project where you were actually in the director's seat, if you will, was Age of Apocalypse. While you were involved with Executioner's Song, while you were involved with Fatal Attractions, this was the most surprising bit ever.
I will say one thing that was interesting is I realized that I was in charge of Fallon's Covenant too, because that was what introduced Generation X, and Generation and Fallon's Covenant came before Age of Apocalypse. So it's a little fuzzy, but yeah.
Yeah. So basically, like, the knowing, learning the fact that, I used to think, this is my personal opinion, that I used to think that you and Fabian Nachanza were like tag team partners.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but your approaches were completely different one another. And despite having like polar opposite approaches, I'm really like, I cannot imagine myself working along with someone who has a completely opposite approach or a different approach than mine. And then both of us are able to basically produce something that does not contradict or come into conflict with each other's work. In fact, it complements each other's work.
Yeah, that was probably a part of Bob. That was Bob's machinations. Like Fabian and I did not hate each other, but we were definitely rivals. You know, but we weren't like mean rivals. We were just rivals, and that we weren't even. Yeah, I had Uncanny. He had X-Men. That was that, and then eventually he left, and I got both. So, but yeah, I will tell you a funny story. Just so you know, Fabian's name is pronounced so Isiasa.
Nisiye.
So the way that he would tell people is it was knee, and he'd point to his knee. So Nisi Asa. That's how he would. So he and I went to this X-Men wedding event in Washington, D.C., where they held a wedding for Scott and Jean.
Right.
And we were there and we're signing the books and stuff. And so Cyclops has to introduce us at one point. So he comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, I'm really embarrassed, but how do you say Fabian's last name?" And Fabian always got mad and he would always say, Nisi Asa, Nisi Asa. It's not hard, Nisi Asa. So I said to Cyclops, I said, "Oh, it's pronounced knee cheese, like knee and like eating cheese." And he goes, "Oh, okay, okay." So he and just before he's about to introduce him, Fabian comes running up and he has Cyclops by the arm. And he goes, "What did you say to him? What did you tell him?" I said, "Oh, I told him your name is pronounced Nisiesa." He goes, "He said you said knee cheese." I go, "Why would I say knee cheese? I don't, yeah, no, it's Nisiesa." And the guy goes, "Okay." Fabian goes, "Yeah, it's Nisiesa, Nisiesa." So the guy goes up to introduce, and there's like 500, 600 people there. And he goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have two very special guests today. We have Scott Lobdell, Fabian Knee Cheese." Fabian comes up on stage. He goes, "It's Nisiesa, Nisiesa." So, but the poor Cyclops was so like flustered. He say knee cheese, but that was what was in his head.
Do I have the permission to use this story, publish this story on my channel?
For sure. I'm sure he remembers it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So the second part of my interview of legendary comic book writer, Mr. Scott Lobdell. Now, as you can see, I'm wearing a Superman t shirt, and there's a good reason behind that. Mr. Lobdell is actually the first comic book writer, the first comic book legend on my podcast who has written for Superman. So that's why, to honor his presence, I wanted to wear the Superman t shirt. But before I ask him about his tenure at DC Comics, when Mr. Scott Lobdell was breaking into the world of comics and he joined Marvel, his first assignment was pretty closely related to the region we are in, which is the Arabian Peninsula. And Mr. Lobdell, you reminded me that your first assignment was Marvel Comics Presents, where you did a story for Marvel's first Arab Muslim superhero who was created by Bill Mantlo, whose name was Abdul Qamar. So, can you just, before we proceed to your tenure at DC Comics, can you please take us through that particular part as well of your life, of your career?
What happened was that Marvel Comics Presents, imagine you have a comic book, you're an editor, and you have a comic book and you have to deal with a writer, a penciler, an inker, a colorist, a letterer, and that's your job every month. But now imagine you have two books, and in those two books, you're dealing with four writers, four pencilers, four inkers, four colorists, four whatever, and probably four different editors. Editor of the editor, Daredevil, the editor of this one, that one. And so I looked at that right away and I thought, wow, that's really complicated because everything the editor has to do, his name is Terry, had to do was he had to go through, he had to talk to like the Daredevil's editor and go, hey, listen, I have a Daredevil story. Will you read it? And because it's an 8-page story, you can't really do anything with Daredevil. You're not going to make him see again. You're not going to make him like be visited by the ghost of his father and nothing that's going to like impact on him. And so the editors would be like, what is this about? Like, it's not even a Daredevil story. You could have put Captain America in the story, would have been the same thing. So he was just constantly running up against all these different things. I looked at it and I was like, So I went to him and I said, listen, I have a proposal for the Global Village series. And he's like, what is the global? You say that like it's something. What is the Global Village series? I said, well, what if each issue you have a character from a different part of the world
Right.
and characters from Contest of the Champions as an example? And he goes, why would I want to do that? I said, because you can be in charge of the Contest of the Champions characters. No editor is going to be like, Arabian Night is my character, Shamrock's my character, American character. No one will do that. Shamrock, Overmind, all these characters. And so he's like, So I I'd sold something 4 years prior to Power Man and Iron Fist. But suddenly in a week, I sold 3 stories. And then 2 weeks, I sold 12 stories. And then in 4 weeks, I sold 27 stories. And by the fifth week, I had sold 86 stories. So I suddenly became a full time writer because I was writing 86 stories. And they were all 8-page stories. So what I did then was I started to I used Lockjaw at one point.
Right.
Editor came up to me, and what I would do is as soon as I would get a character, whether it's Lockjaw, Arabian Night, or Shamrock, I'd go like proud as a peacock to the rest of the bullpen, and I go, I just got the Lockjaw story. And they're like, who was asking for a Lockjaw story? And Lockjaw story is a perfect example. He saves these kids from a fire, and was a really sweet, sweet story. And then the editor, I was walking down the hall, and the editor stops me. He goes, "Hey," he goes, "I read that Lockjaw story. That was the best Lockjaw story I ever read." And in my head, I'm thinking it was the only Lockjaw story you'd ever read. Lockjaw's never been in a story by himself.
Which editor was that, by the way?
Oh, I'd rather not say. I don't want to make him feel foolish. So,
Okay. Okay. Sure. Sure. Perfectly respect that.
but is also angry, like his useless daughter has these powers as far as he was concerned. So suddenly you have an 8-page story that's this kind of like mini family epic drama, And once I did enough of those, people started going, wow, he does comedy. Like one time I did a paladin story. It's called Around the World in 8 Pages.
Right.
Takes a job where he's a thief. And then that leads to the mobsters who stole something. And then that leads to the government who's after the monsters. And then that leads to aliens. And, so suddenly within 8 pages, you've created this like action comedy global story.
Right.
So each story that I did was different, and each story I did was different. It just made it seem like editors knew, like, oh, okay, if we bring this to Scott, Scott's going to create something there. He's not just going to make the same story over and over and over and over, or the same tone over and over and over. So, and then when the X-Men opened up, they're like, oh, here's a guy that can do, a big event, but also the small character moments inside of it. So it was all what's the word? Practice.
Right.
It was skills for, they say when that being successful is being in the right place at the right time, as you can be in the right place at the right time and not be prepared, or you can be very prepared and never get to that right place, even if you're at the right time and you're prepared. So I think you really have to know that when the opportunity presents itself, you have to be ready for it, even if it means writing 86 of the silliest 8-page stories ever.
Starting with Abdul Khamar.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, sir, I have been itching to ask you questions to understand your discourse with DC Comics.
Okay.
I so much into it is because your name is closely associated with the X-Men franchise, Heroes Reborn, Marvel Comics. But when it comes to your career at DC Comics, what I was quite astonished to see, I looked up all of your work that's being sold on Amazon, for example. Superman, Hell on Earth, Teen Titans, Red Hood and the Outlaws,
Superboy for a while.
Superboy for a while. And all I saw was that all of your work were having rating of at least 4 stars out of 5. And a lot of them had 4.5 stars out of 5. And these were not like 1 or 2 ratings, customer ratings, verified ratings. These are like in their hundreds, if not thousands. So can you like basically that why your accomplishments, your career at DC Comics remains quite under discussed, if not understated?
That would probably have to be well, I'll tell you, let's look at it this way, is that I had been gone for a while, and then I was asked to come back with the new 52. 52 started, they said, okay, you'll be doing Titans. And I said, okay, that sounds fun because it makes sense, like X-Men guy, Titans guy.
Yeah.
And so I turned in the issue, and this is where before I understood what the new 52 was. And what it was is that Titans would be reaching their 100th anniversary when about time they canceled it. So I wrote essentially what was issue 101. I turned it in. They go, no, we don't want this at all. We're not looking for a continuation. We're looking for a whole new way of looking at all these characters. Like in this version, Teen Titans, this is the first time we're seeing them. I said, oh, kind of a cool job to have to reimagine something. But the fans really wanted Titans 101.
The continuation.
Yeah, they just wanted the book that they read. And when you think about it, if you're reading a book, you want the book to be entertaining. You don't want it to change into something else. Fans who were following it were like, hey, this is different. What's going on? And new fans came in, and I think that's probably the difference is that new fans looked and said, wow, these Teen Titans are really cool. what's going on. Oh, look, Cassie and him might be sleeping together. We can't tell. There's little clues. Whereas the other people were like, I had a scene where Bart was walking around with Tim's T-shirt. Sure, I grew up with six brothers and sisters, and he a child, and he was out of town, and I needed a tux, so I went in his closet and I got him his tux. And
Right.
he goes, "Do you know cost?" I go, I don't know how much it took. How much does it cost you? It's a lot. They had like four tuxes in his closet. So he's like, "I can't believe you stole that from me." I go, "I didn't steal it. I borrowed it, and it's back in the closet now. What's the big deal?" But I realized that that's how me, when you grow up in a big family, you share. That's what you do. You share.
Yes.
And a child, no one's asking you to try on your tux. And so similarly, you have Tim Drake, works with Batman. Everything is very regimented and thoughtful and focused. And you have Bart, he's like, oh, no. I got to wear something. So he threw on a shirt. And so then Tim is berating him for borrowing his shirt. And Bart's like, what's the big deal? And I remember seeing online people like going, he ruined it. Tim would, Tim would always give him a shirt or whatever. It was and it's like, okay, that Tim that you've been reading would, but this Tim just met Bart,
Right.
met this new Bart with his own attitudes. Same thing with Cassie. And so I was writing it as if these characters didn't know each other, but I was writing it in a way because that's what somebody said. Somebody said, like, Bart's like a little brother to him. I go, yeah, eventually he is, but that's what we're going to get to. We'll see like, to me, it's fun. You get to see the relationships build from scratch.
Right.
That most people, I mean, a lot of people weren't reading George and Marv when Titan started, so they're not aware of it, or they watch the TV show. So this was going to give people the ability to get in and be like, okay, this is my Titans. These are the characters. We know that they're going to be best friends. We know we're going to see them form a family unit at some point. And so I think the difference is that I think all the books had their very devoted fans to the New 52 because these are people who hadn't picked up Teen Titans in ever, if at
Right.
all.
Right.
52. So they had a certain expectations, and then the people who had known the characters for 30, 40 years. And that's the other thing too, is I have to say, like, it's so wild to me because as a person of my age, like Kitty Pryde's a perfect example. Was 16 when I read her the first time, I believe, maybe even younger.
14 when she joined the X-Men.
So she's 14, and 35 years later, 40 years later, I don't know how long it's been, but 4 years later, there are people that still want her to be 14 or act 14, and some writer comes on and makes her seem like a 30-year-old, soccer mom,
Yeah.
and somebody else and writes her this way, and everybody like wants, like Jimmy Olsen, for perfect example. Jimmy Olsen had to stay at Clark's apartment. I got mad because, Jimmy was a young guy and he had money, and and at one point Superman comes in, Jimmy's in the shower with this girl. And, Clark's like, oh, and, and it's like, and the instant that, even before I left the book, there are writers on the book that suddenly went from this older Jimmy Olsen that had been established for a few years, although I kind of made him more of a little more cooler than geekier. But the instant, even before I left, they had like, uh, "Hey, Miss Olsen, hey, Miss Lane, I got you a coffee. Do you need anything?" And it's like, why the fuck do you want to see the same, And then they're like, "Well, he's Superman's best friend." Why on earth would he be Superman's best friend? Like, what? Like, is Superman brain damaged or something that like he has to hang around with this? Hey, Mister uh, Kent, did you see Superman was just here? And like, what's Superman? Oh yeah, Jimmy, I did see him. Years of this, for God's sake, like, why not? You know, I mean, the whole idea behind New 52 was to change up what we know about what we've seen and look at it with a different set of eyes, you know? And like with Lois was moving in with her boyfriend and she got a text and she looked concerned. So Superman glanced over to see what the text was, and it was about moving her stuff into his apartment that night. And Clark was like, "Oh." And people got so angry. They're like, "Oh, Clark would never, or Superman would never read someone's text. That
So
would be an invasion of privacy." And I'm thinking, of course he would. He doesn't, like, of course he would. He would 100%. I mean, like, think of a guy, he's sitting there at his typewriter and he hears uh, burglars break into a bank and say, "Everybody freeze," or and he's like, "Oh, this is a job for Superman." And you get out and you go and save everybody. Like, this is a guy who's on 24/7, sees a cat in a tree from 10 blocks away and he sees a little kid about to fall. So why would he be like, "Oh, no, I can't read these texts. I can listen to everybody's thoughts. I can, stop any crime. I can do anything." But, oh, yeah, no, that'd be weird if I were. So to me, that was a sign of like a Superman that exists in the here and now,
right.
like Boy Scout Superman from, and even then, Superman, I wouldn't, it's not like Superman doesn't have a temper. It's not like things don't make him sad. Like, yeah, if he's curious and his friend looks concerned and, she's on a text, he's like, "Oh, what is it?" Okay. I mean, like, how many times have you walked into a room and you read a letter upside down? Just, "Oh, this is, you look at someone's desk and you go, "Oh, he's made his grocery list." It's like, it doesn't have to be, he wasn't stalking. He was just,
Concern, a genuine concern for someone he loves.
yeah. And he has powers that you and I don't have, like, and frankly, if you and I had them, we would be reading things too. So, you can't have an alien come and be raised on Earth and then be annoyed when he acts like somebody with superpowers, because he is. He's someone, he's certainly way beyond you and I. So to think that we're gonna whip him into shape and make him think like you and I is, I mean, even Superman. How many people do you know would 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, look out for everybody else around them? You know,
Nobody.
to take Superman, who's this very particular entity, and try to make him act like human, like these are human rules and you have to obey them. I mean, how many times does Superman grab somebody by the collar and drop them off at the police station?
Right.
And like, what happens when the cops come out and they go, "Oh," to the guy, "What'd you do?" And he goes, "Nothing. Superman just grabbed me out of the back of the collar and dropped me here off here." And they're like, "Okay, well, we can't press charges. See you later." Like, you know, like Superman.
Can I
So
can I just say, would it be a fair assessment from my end that this was an attempt by DC Comics to compete with Marvel's Ultimate Universe, because the Ultimate Universe was redefining the classic flagship superheroes for a modern age with modern morality, and DC was doing the same thing with New 52 after the Flashpoint episode. And next thing you know, in your case, you got bombarded by the PC mob.
I wouldn't say PC, but I mean, maybe there's some of that. But I also, it's kind of an interesting statement, because before Ultimates, there was, what's the word I'm looking for? There was, well, there were about five crises. Crisis on this, crisis on
Right.
that.
Infinite Earths, yes. Final Crisis, yes.
Yeah, and before that, there was Moon Knight, and before that, there was the Justice Society and the Justice League of America, where suddenly, Wonder Woman was, or, you know, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman were suddenly not there. And this new Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, who acted very unlike they were in, I guess Batman was never in Justice Society, but I guess what I'm saying is that it is not all at all uncommon, and there was nothing really new
Mm.
about the new 52, with the exception that it was theoretically across the board. And I say theoretically, I was assigned 3 different books, 4 different books at one point, And each time I got the book, I was told, make this different, you know,
Right.
make it like reimagine. And it's funny because I came up with this whole really cool way to do Bizarro, like a new Bizarro, like instead of, me am confused, you am smart, like instead of that same whatever, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do a different type of Bizarro.
Someone who's not close to Solomon Grundy.
Yeah, and somebody who's very, very close to Clark. And I was like, if what's his face, if his father Jarrell isn't going to take his human baby and send him out into space and be like, well, I wonder if that's going to work. You know, like he would. We used to send monkeys and dogs and whatever. So for him to say, listen, I'm going to make this vessel, I'm going to load it with cells, and we're going to see what happens to a Kryptonian in outer space under different stars and da 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 da. And I sent him off, and the research comes back. He's like, "Oh, that's perfect." Meanwhile, it's still going around, spinning around. The cells are bonding, they're forming, they're becoming a living being. That living being is growing up in this shuttle. And I thought, how bizarre that would be like if he met himself, but like a version of himself that was like completely fucked up.
Right.
And so I took that in and I had Chris draw how he would look, and he looks so cool. And they came to me and they go, listen, this character's really cool, but you shouldn't call him Bizarro. Make him something new. I said, but it's cool because it's a new Bizarro. That's what makes him cool. And they go, no, no, make him new. And so that's when I came up with the origin for Hell.
So basically, Hell, this
Yeah.
Kryptonian, was actually supposed to be the refined version of Bizarro for New 52. Wow.
And that many times, like I did a character who's this brother, this brother can't stand light. And so his brother would bring him people that he could absorb their light from, you know,
Right.
the light. And I loved it so much. And I said, and so that was originally Dr. Light. I'm like, how can I do Dr. Light different? Like frankly, I never understood Dr. Light. He had a power and then the Asian woman became Dr. Light. And it's like, okay, like, what is Dr. Light? So I was on the phone and I said, "Yeah, I came up with the new Doctor Light. It's really creepy and scary." Dan was on the phone with the editors, and he goes, "Well, he was already a rapist. Like, what could be scarier than that?" I go, "Well, I don't really like the idea of using rape as a storytelling tool. So, if I'm going to look at Doctor Light, it's like, how do you do a new Doctor Light? They kept saying do new stuff for to New 52, and I would do new stuff for New 52, and they all be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! What are you doing?" You know, I'm doing what you told me to do. So that happened a lot, and but Hell was a great example of a character that I loved him. I loved him as how he came out, but I also loved him knowing what he was originally supposed to be. And like I'll tell you, when I turned in the pitch, I turned in a very developed pitch. And one of the things that I wanted to do was in the first issue, I was going to have Jimmy Olsen is on a plane and the plane blows up and he's falling and he hits his signal ring. And as he's falling, we know what's going to happen. We know Superman's going to save him at the last second. And, da, da, da. And meanwhile, Superman gets involved with something and he's fighting and it's this war and these people and they're above, above, above. And Jimmy is like heading to the ground and it's getting pretty close. Pretty close. He's going in pretty fast.
Right.
And Superman is in the middle of this thing. And on the last page, Jimmy's like, and Clark is where he is. And he just turns around and just says, I'm sorry. And boom, Jimmy hits the ground. He's dead. And so that was the issue. And then they're like, oh, well, you can't kill Jimmy. I go, well, and I forget why, but I had him come back. And when he came back, he was able to reincarnate people, like bring them back to life. And I said, I think it would be really cool because Clark would be mortified and say, Jimmy, you can't bring people back to life. screws up timelines. It's whatever, their soul's gone. Like, you don't know what is up. And Jimmy, who has this new powers now, is like, how is that any different than what you do? Like, you save a plane full of 50 people, and oh, yeah, yeah, great, you're the hero. But 50 people crash and I bring them back, and all of a sudden I'm a monster. Like, what the fuck is that about? And so it's going to be okay if they're going to be best friends are going to fight. And what do you fight about? But something that's like super duperly profound, you know? It's
Yeah.
like, even how many times did you bring me back to life? I was essentially dead. I was about to slam into a mountain. I was about to get crushed by a building, and you're there saving me. How is that any different, Clark? And so I thought, oh, that'd be like a really cool thing. So
Gave
I didn't
both
get
of them a moment or a master class in philosophy, basically. That both of them are somehow trying to justify their heroism, their
that.
respective versions of heroism.
What decisions do you get to make? For every person Superman saves in Africa, probably someone in Alaska at the time was about to get, hit with a truck full of logs. Like, you got to make your decisions. So why is Clark's decisions more elevated than Jimmy's in this particular situation? But then they're like, no, no, you can't kill him. I'm like, okay. And they say, well, because they'll know he's not dead. I go, I'm not even trying to pretend. I'm not being a writer where, like, you kill somebody and then, 20 issues later you bring them back. I wanted him to, like, get up and be like, "Oh, wow, that was weird," not
Right.
realizing that he died, but I just couldn't win that fight.
Now, there is one thing that you shared with us, something which was very new, at least for a guy like me, because you told us that yourself and Fabian Nissis had completely different approach towards writing comic book stories. Fabian was more a plan oriented individual, whereas you were the day by day person. You lived by the day. Was that the same thing that you were practicing when you were at DC?
It was a little different because DC was very specifically trying to accomplish a very specific goal across 98% of their books. So every few months, we would have to write our 6-issue plan, and
Hmm.
then they would go over it and go, "Oh, well, this is blah, 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 blah." And so I did have to be a little more focused. But I'll give you an example of, like, when I wanted to make Bizarro smart. That would be interesting if Bizarro was like Flowers for Algernon. He got so smart that it was distracting. Couldn't even talk to him because he was so smart. And I went to my editor and I said, "Hey, I want to do a few issues of Bizarro being smart." And he goes, "All right, but just 3." I said, "Why just 3?" And he said, "Because they know he's not going to stay smart, so they're going to come back. They know he's going to come back, so just do it for 3 issues." And I said, what I always say to editors, I say, "Look, if we do the same thing every time, and then the audience is like, oh, they're doing the same thing again, and then we wind up doing the same thing because that's what we did every other time." I said, "Yeah, then they're going to get bored, and they're going to be like, oh, they're feeding us the same thing again." But I knew I wasn't going to win the battle with them. He wound up 2 issues in, he got reassigned to another book, and I got a new editor. And I sat down to it, and he goes, "Yeah, yeah, this is really cool what you're doing with Bizarro." I said, "Listen, I'm not trying to take advantage of you as my new editor and say, oh, yeah, 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 this was the whole plan. Da, 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 da." I said, "I'm telling you that he asked me to do 3 issues." I said, "But the way that I like to write is I like to run down a blind alley and see where it is. And maybe there's another story there. Maybe there's 10 stories there. Maybe there's 2 years worth of Bizarro as smart stories. I don't know, but you can always come back and go, all right, that didn't work. Let's wrap this up. You
Right.
know,
Right.
take off in a different direction." And so in that way, I was always trying to keep the avenue open to see where things went, Like, and this is the opposite of what I'm about to say, but I did a story and I was like, you know what, it would be cool. I think the biggest problem with Warlord was that he always looked like, he has the silver beard and the goatee and the silver hair, and he's running around in his underwear. And I always thought, the idea behind the Warlord world is interesting. So why don't we make like a younger astronaut who goes in space and he lands and he winds up in the Scutaris? Okay, that's cool. And they're always trying to de-age their heroes because they felt that they were too young. So I wrote the approved, great, approved. And then the issue where I forget why, but they got separated and suddenly they were on this island and there's like a pterodactyl there or something. And they started drawing the first issue and then they came to me and they said, yeah, you can't use a Scutaris. I'm like, okay. And so then I said, okay, at the end of the issue, you pull back and there's a giant question mark. And so this became the Mystery Island, Adventures of Mystery Island. But it was supposed to be, and it got approved, it was all going to be the, what do you call it, the introduction of Scutars for the new 52. But it didn't happen. It just became an island with monsters on it. So sometimes you just have to, sometimes you're not in control and you have to, you know, adapt to what they've told you. So I would tell you something you might find this interesting is that there's a retreat, and I sat down, and Dan goes, "Because Scott, I don't get it. You write Teen Titans as if they've never met each other, and then you write the Outlaws as if they're known each other forever." Like he goes, I can't recall Roy and Jason ever even talking to each other before this.
Right.
And I think, but I said, yeah, well, I was, you said you wanted a new version of the new 52. And I said, since these characters hadn't been together, I was like, I was stealing from Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, like if you ever saw the movie
Yes.
and then you read you go, oh, yeah, you stole it from. It was like a tribute to
Butch Cassidy at the Sundance Kid.
Yeah, right up until the wife who married Sundance but was in love with the other one.
Robert and Paul Newman.
But and Catherine Ross as Mrs. Sundance. But it's like we were talking before. Like I love what George and Marv did with Teen Titans, like everybody else loved it. But I don't need to see Corey pining away for Dick Grayson for 40 years. Yeah. The character, I think it's insulting to the way we experience time when we're reading comic books. And I think people got less and less interested. And in fact, it wasn't until Redhead and the Outlaws #1 that suddenly Star is my favorite character. Yes, she's your favorite character. Yeah. I mean, I would believe she was like number 9 out of 50. I mean, she was an interesting character, but she wasn't everybody's favorite character. She was just, but the instant Red Hood and the Outlaws came and I ruined her, suddenly she became like this untouchable icon. And I'm like, and then when I left, not I left, when they took her out of the book and they put her in her own Starfire book,
Right.
and she's like, squirrel, or she's like running around naked in front of a guy going, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to wear clothes. And it's like, okay, so that's somehow a positive representation of a woman, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, I don't know, it's just, but the idea.
So we can get away with that. I think they were thinking that she's an alien woman, so we can get away with that. Alien female, not a woman, alien female.
Yes, but when I said that I was writing an alien female character, suddenly they're all, you know, and look at what's his name, Beast Boy. I remember Beast Boy from 30 years ago was hitting on
Raven.
Well, he eventually Raven, but he was always like after Corey, and like he can't, Dick can't satisfy you like I can, and I mean he was just like always saying, oh hey, nice, let me, turn into monkey,
Yeah.
and so that's okay. But Roy and Jason treating her as an adult woman who makes her own decisions, that's suddenly sexist, you know? So saying, hey, do something different, I would do something different, and people would freak out. But to your point about eBay and the ratings, to this day, I mean, I can't tell you how many people it's been, I don't know, 5 years now,
Yeah.
and conventions, and people come up and they go, I love that was the favorite. But I said, which one? Everyone, every manifestation of that series, I loved it, you know, and it has such huge fans. And then you have these other fans who are like, you ruined Starfire. You ruined, you ruined this. You ruined that. It's like, okay, if you read it and with one set of eyes, you're probably going to enjoy it. And if you read it with, you know, 40-year-old eyes or 55-year-old eyes, chances are you're not going to necessarily.
I just feel that, Neo 52 came at a time when, you know, a lot of unwarranted changes were happening within the society and at a global level. Now I feel that things have calmed down a little bit. I mean, I'm not talking about from the point of war or something like that, but when I'm talking about is like, for example, from a very specific comics discourse, there is much more appreciation now toward the classical interpretation, if I can use the word classical here, our favorite superheroes. I mean, the works that were done in the 80s, the works that were done in the 90s, even like, for example, we know that when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were doing the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards would be this 60s, very, how should I say, not oppressive, but a very demanding husband, someone who would be tough with his wife, always scolding her for anything she would say or concern she would say. I mean, I was reading Galactus trilogy, and Susan tells Reed that, Reed, can you just like tidy up a bit because your beard is growing and stuff? And he reacts in an aggressive way. But right now, what's happening is that what I'm seeing is that like people are reading it without creating a fuss about it online. There is more genuine discussion. There are people are not employing presentism to understand and read the comics of the past, because a lot of the things that were part of the norm back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is not normal anymore. Things have changed, things have evolved. But to appreciate work, because why am I saying that? And why am I saying that to you is because before becoming a content creator, I was part of the world of marketing and digital marketing. Okay. And, we shouldn't trust everything that's written online. But when there are mechanisms involved to ensure that whatever is being written online is at least somehow vetted, in the case of Amazon's customer reviews. And when I look at your work right now, if let's say what you were facing back then had uh, had basically continued, people wouldn't be buying your story trade paperbacks of your stories. In fact, we find something totally opposite about it. Red Hood and the Outlaws is like on Amazon, one of the highest listed, the highest, the maximum reviews, positive reviews coming in for it. But at the same time, your work for the Teen Titans and your work for Superman is as appreciated as your work for, let's say, the Age of Apocalypse, Operation Zero Tolerance, and Fatal Attractions, and all these that you did in the 90s, Onslaught. This is what I'm trying to basically say. I mean, obviously, you might disagree with me on that, but this is how I feel. This is, I mean, like my observation, if you will, limited.
Well, you talked about like 60s and 70s and Reed, being rude to Sue, which I don't ever remember him being rude to Sue, but I will take your word for it. But I'll say this, if I may, and you can tell me if this makes sense. Did I tell you about the diversity panel I was on?
Diversity panel? No, sir.
Okay, so this was about 6, maybe 5 years ago. I was at a convention and these people came up and they said, listen, we're doing a panel on diversity and we don't have enough guests. Will you come and talk? And I said, sure. So I come and talk and they're saying, well, I think diversity is important. I think diversity is important, blah, blah, blah. And then they turn to me and they go, now, Scott, you've been in the business for a while. How do you feel about this new push for diversity? Like, does it sit well with you? Like, are you used to doing it one way? And I said, I am so grateful that the rest of the industry has caught up to what I was doing 30 years ago, you know, and that somebody has taken the word diversity and they've applied a word to what I've been doing for 30 years. And
Right.
if you look at the racial and female breakdown of Generation X, I mean that could not be. I mean that could not be any more modern than it is now, 30 years later. You know, I mean it was ahead of its time 30 years ago.
Even the way you were positioning Jean Grey, even the way you were positioning Rogue, Storm. I mean, Generation X is your crown jewel, if I can call it that, because if we read about you, everybody
Far,
mentions. Huh?
so far it is.
So far, it is okay. So far, Generation X is your crown jewel, but at the same time, the treatment that you did, the stories that you told, the positioning that you provided to characters, female characters, or a character like Bishop, for example, who is from a different race and he's a character from the future. I mean, but the thing is that there came a time. Let me try to explain it in a better way. I might not have explained it in a better way. There came a time in the last 10 years, maybe before 2020, before the COVID outbreak happened, that there was so much criticism for the sake of criticism going on for all that was done in the past when it came to our superhero. And that was becoming really frustrating because I grew up reading comics from the 70s. I grew up reading comics from the 80s. And then as I grew older, I started to collect trade paperbacks. I started to collect back issues. And obviously, it's really refreshing that when you go back in time, you see things. And I might not have used the right word for Reed, but he was the traditional American husband of that era, 1960s, the 50s and 60s. Because when you read about the Fantastic Four today, yes, they still are a dysfunctional family and everything, but Reed's composure has changed significantly compared to what Stanley and Jack Kirby. And by the way, I'm not criticizing them. What I am saying is that they were reflecting what was the norm of their time into the comic books.
Interesting, because I'll tell you, to me, the funniest thing about Reed Richards is they would, like Galactus would show up.
Yeah.
He would run into his lab and he would grab a device, and then they were like, "We got to get there. Let's get in the Fantastic Car." And they'd be flying to the Fantastic Car, and somebody would always say, "What's the plan, Reed?"
Yeah.
And he'd always say, "I can't go into it now."
Yeah.
And
Yes. Yes.
the before we get to Galactus, I think he couldn't tell. And then whenever he would tell, he'd be like, "Johnny, light the sky up," and Johnny lights the sky. Ben, punch him in the foot, and he punches him in the foot, and then it comes together, and people go, "Oh, Reed, you're so smart," and it's like there's zero reason Reed couldn't have said, "Hey, listen, here's what I'm." He doesn't like flame because he's in space. His weak spot is his toe. We're gonna get there. You do this, you do that. But it was always like he would never tell his plan, and so that's not a quintessential husband. I think I always thought he was a bit of a dodo. Like he was distracted with the world around him. Like he was so much on the spectrum
Right.
that I think, and even when Sue would come in and, rub his back, like long before they got married,
Yeah.
I don't think he had contempt for her. I think he just didn't. He's like, she might be rubbing his back and he's like looking at the stars but I don't think he was.
He was always married. He was always married to his research and his work.
He wasn't always married to his wife, but.
Yeah.
Yeah. Married until what issue? What issue did they get married in?
It was one of the earlier issues because this happened during the time of Stan and Jack. That happened in the 60s.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but that could have been. I wish I had my phone. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I do think change, but I also, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I don't think it's as new a change as you might think it is. And also it's very weird to me because, like, what's happening, especially well, at DC, and then what is it? Like when I did, you were talking the other day about zero tolerance and how I wanted to shrink the team down to, their Volkswagen era, you know,
Right. Right.
and now Marvel comes out with this new into from the out of the ashes, and they're like, we did the Krakoa stuff, and that's behind us. Now we're going to do something new. All they've done is like, oh, Professor X got arrested. Where? Oh, in the Krakoa thing that we're not talking about. Like they keep referencing Krakoa, and I'm like, are you starting new? You're not starting new. You're what are you doing? Because I feel like I'm reading the final chapters of the Krakoa story that no one asked for. You know That's how it feels to me. And, and then over at DC, they have, Absolute Batman, and Absolute
Yes.
this, and Absolute Joker, and Absolutely Absolute, and whatever. And it's like, if I was a fan, I would really not know where to start, Like, I'd be curious what the absolute numbers are doing to the regular Batman numbers, because I don't think you're a Batman fan and you're reading Absolute going, oh, this is totally different, but completely the same.
One thing I can share with you from our part of the world is that, like, Absolute Comics are selling out fast.
And the new thing always sells out fast, unless it's like, Marvel 2099 or something.
Here's the thing, Mr. Lobdell. I mean, you can attest to this fact more than I can that the first issue has the hype. The bigger challenge is that if the subsequent issues that come after the first issue, are they good enough to maintain a decent sales level? So here, at least, I can say that, like, Absolute Superman, Absolute Batman, Absolute Martian Manhunter, they are really performing good. At the same time, at the same time, sorry, please, you were saying something?
I was just saying, where do those numbers come from? They have to come from somewhere, and I'm assuming this is a problem that Marvel and DC both do, is they cannibalize from their own readership.
Yes.
Like if you like Batman and suddenly there's a new Absolute Batman and that sells, retailers only have so much money, and they only have so much money to get the comic books in advance, order them, and know what they're going to get in order to figure out how they're going to sell. So the story, but uh, there's a time at Marvel, DC, where DC almost went bankrupt. They never talk about it, but what happened was they did Arkham Asylum, and it sold through the roof, but it was a $29 book.
Is it in the Arkham Asylum?
And what happened was that the retailers didn't have any money for Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and that. Like, so they put all their money behind, they cut their numbers and they put all their money behind.
Arkham Asylum.
And that month it sold out and nobody came in and was like, what happened to our issues of Wonder Woman? They're just like, you're like, oh, wow, that was great. And then retailers were like, why do I order 10 issues of Wonder Woman and 10 issues of Green Lantern and 10 issues of, and you multiply that by 3,000 comic book stores in America at the time. And all of
Right.
a sudden, DC was like, no one's buying our books. No one's ordering them. Not even that they're not buying them, they're not ordering them.
Right.
They're like, geez, why the hell were we spending all these money and getting and sitting with, all these extra copies of Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and every other book? And that almost crippled them because people were like, retailers were, well, like, look, I have this money. I can put it towards another X-Men book. I can put it towards, another Spider-Man story, the Clone Saga, whatever, because they had essentially broken the audience away from being dependent on these books that no one liked and the retailers. So you never know. Like I'd be curious to see where the numbers. I remember once when New 52 when they did New 52 and Superman Unchained came out
Right.
in New York, and I went over to this comic book store in Poughkeepsie, and I looked, and the guy had two full shelves like like the size of couches, like stacked up on each other,
Right.
and they were, every issue of, it was the type of thing where if you wanted the super duper special Superman Unchained hologram, you had to buy every other issue.
Right.
And I went in the guy, I go, who did the ordering on this? I'm just curious. And he goes, oh, I did. I go, do you expect to sell all the? Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. They'll sell eventually. I'm thinking, I don't think you're going to be around by the sell. And I mean, it turns out they're not selling anymore. But I mean, it's not a store anymore. But the thing is that like you can say Superman Unchained was the highest selling comic book this month and da da da, but you're also draining the retailers and because they have to pay for these books, and you're also frustrating the
Reader.
readers, or you're frustrating them because somebody goes out and buys all of them, or you're frustrating them because I can't afford 30 covers of
The same.
yeah, and so it's just that it's bad faith, but then people point to the numbers and think, oh, look how good we're doing, and it's like to me, you look at well, it's an interesting theory because I haven't seen, I don't know what the numbers are on Hush, but the same way that in the old days, Days to Future Past existed within issues of Uncanny.
Yes.
I know 1.5 issues that we remember very fondly, but Born Again with Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli
Yes.
was part of the series. Like they didn't stop and go somewhere else and put out another series. They just did Daredevil and the storyline called that. They did the same thing with Craven the Hunter. They didn't do Craven's Last Hunt as its own thing. They did it in the series to try to get the attention for the series. I would say how would Absolute Batman sell as much if it was Detective Comics and you did this story about this alternate Batman? Would Superman sell as much if he just was in Action Comics in the same world? Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. But the point is that, like I say, the money has to come from somewhere. They're all on a limited budget. We're all on a limited budget. So you can jump up and down, not you, but DC and Marvel can jump up and down and be like, look at all these books of whatever we're selling, Absolute Batman. But in a way, is that really beneficial to their bottom line because Scott's eventually going to go off and do something else. I don't know, it's interesting. But the one point that you look at Hush, and Hush does not seem to have made much of a impact.
Yes, and I think your argument is all valid because you reminded me of Age of Apocalypse. So, Age of Apocalypse was actually part of the ongoing series. The only thing was that it was briefly rebranded, that Uncanny X-Men became Astonishing X-Men, Wolverine became Weapon X, Cable became X-Man. So, it was not cannibalization, it was addressing the crossover event very effectively. And then when things in the story came back to normal, all the old titles came back.
And they didn't relaunch them as number ones or.
Yeah, exactly. Right now, too many relaunches, not every quarter, but almost every 2 months, there's a huge crossover event that's going to change DC and Marvel forever. And then the variant covers, it's becoming a pain, especially if you just link it up with something in order to basically get the full experience. Good storytelling, do you think, has taken a back seat at the big two?
I couldn't say because I don't read them, so I really couldn't say. But just from a marketing point of view, I don't know if I told you this. We're trying to figure out how to market New 52. I'm not New 52, Age of Apocalypse. And I was in the office, and I just happened to be in the office that day, and Bob, the phone rings, and he goes, "Oh," and he picks the phone and goes, "Hello? Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't know. Let me hold on a sec." And he goes, "It's marketing. They want to know how they're supposed to market Age of Apocalypse." And I said, "Tell them we're canceling all the books, and we're gonna relaunch them as different books, but we're going to cancel all the X titles." He goes, "Oh, okay. Yeah, we're going to cancel all the X titles and replace them with number ones of this series." And he goes, "Okay, okay, great, thanks." He goes, "They love it," and we were both like, "They love it. It's insane. Why would anybody?"
Okay.
And but it was like, don't go by Scott Lobdell's crazy ideas. Yeah. So to answer your question, I don't really know. I mean, they may be the best stories ever written, but seems unlikely. But I'll tell you, when the new 50, like when the X-Men came out, and I looked at that lineup, I was like, none of these books are going to be here in 10 issues. And I didn't wasn't taking into account that they were doing a lot of them bi-weekly, but it's also like I don't think a single book of that line has like made people go, "Oh my God, the X-Men are back." It just feels, and it already feels like they're talking about like, "Oh, we're going to cancel it, and these are mini series and da 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 da." And it's like, I'll just say this without talking about Ashes or anything, is that there just seem to be less and less and less and less books that reach issue 25, that reach issue 50, that reach issue. I mean, there are books that do that, but they seem to be exceedingly less and less and less. And the fact that you can't get an X-Men book up to 25, a little batshit to me.
Yes, I totally agree. I totally agree.
Might not have to do with, as you say, good writing or whatever, however you phrased it. It might not have anything to do with that. Maybe it is a whole bunch of other reasons, but I think a big reason is that they're just telling stories that don't excite, you know.
I have just one point to add, and I think I did mention it when we were talking about X-Men and we touched upon the Krakoan saga briefly. For me, it's the lack of consistency when it comes to the editorial side of things. The first ever X-Men comic book I bought was written by Chris Claremont. This is 87. From 1987 till 1991, X-Men comic I bought, my parents bought me, was written by Chris Claremont. Then, when Chris left X-Men and left Marvel, any comic book I read of Uncanny X-Men was written by Scott Lobdell.
Thank God.
Larry Hama writing Wolverine. Larry Hama writing G.I. Joe. Fabian Nicieza writing X-Men. Fabian Nicieza writing Cable. Mark Grunwald, the late Mark Grunwald, writing Captain America. They would continue their stint. Each and every one of you would continue your stint for at least 5 years, if not 10 years. Now, House of X, Powers of X, written by Jonathan Hickman, R.B. Silva's art, amazing. I'm like blown away with the concept that he comes in. Lo and behold, House of X, Powers of X comes to a conclusion. We reach to X-Men number 1, and we learn that Jonathan Hickman is not going to be writing any of the X books.
Why did he,
Come again, sir?
they say why he stopped her?
I didn't come across any credible information that would explain why he did so. And to this day, he is writing for Marvel. So he could have been someone like you, someone like Chris Claremont, who would take the X-Men and the X books for the next 10 years at least. And right now, what's happening is that, from the ashes, this relaunch that has happened, this is the first time in my life that I'm not interested in X-Men. And I am someone who is a hardcore fan of X-Men to this day. I mean, like, my prized possession is all of the work that was produced before the Krakoans.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I've only read interviews or pieces written by Tom, but his point of view is like, I found the team that can execute my vision. And it's like, no one's supposed to care about your vision. The writers are supposed to present story. You as an editor go, oh, that's very entertaining, or that's not interesting to me. But this notion that, you know, suddenly everybody is like, oh, well, where do you think we should go? You know, like why do we care where, like why anybody thinks that the editor should plan out the vision and hand it off like homework assignments. I think that's crazy. I've never even heard of that. So
Reward, I'm glad you mentioned him because Tom Reward is an anomaly for me because he is someone who is grew up reading comic books, who read the works of Stan Lee, who read the works of Cary Bates, who read the works of any other major writer that I can think of, Mort Weisinger. And next thing you know, I mean, like you have been exposed so much to the classical work. You were a typical comic book nerd, if you will. And you were growing up in the United States. You weren't someone like me. I mean, I had a very limited access. Getting 10 comic books every year was a huge challenge for guys like us over here. And next thing you know, I mean, like, this is what you are giving us in the end. If I ask you, after saying farewell to the world of comics, which remains your best, most memorable time? Was it at Marvel Comics? Was it at DC Comics?
well, it was certainly at Marvel because I mean, it was just a life changing event. It totally turned my entire life upside down.
Mr. Lobdell, you have now transitioned to the world of Hollywood. Not now, I mean, it's been quite a long time now for you to be writing screenplays and scripts for quite a lot of projects that are going to be available or that are already available on streaming services. And also, some of them are getting adapted for the silver screen. Can you just share how this journey has been? Because you were coming in from a very hardcore publishing background and from pulp magazine publishing background. How has this discourse been so far for you?
Well, I mean, it's been really fun, but I'll tell you, when I first got to Hollywood, I'd sell a project based on like a comic book I did, for example, Ball and Chain.
Right.
And they would go, oh my God, we love this. We love this. We got to find somebody to write it. And I go, I could write it. And they're like, oh, no, 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 no. You're a comic book writer. We need a screenwriter.
Uh-huh.
And I said, is there a vault somewhere where they keep special words that only screenwriters are allowed to look at and use? And they go, no. I said, well, I think that I could use the same words that I use for comic books and I could write a movie or a TV pilot. And they're like, well, no, no, it's very, very specific. So this happened, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And then finally I was like, you know what, I'm going to write a script. And I wrote a script. And the next time they said, oh, we really love this. We got to find somebody to write it. My agent was like, well, he wrote this, look at it. And they read it and they're like, oh my God, this is awesome. Yeah, you can write. Yeah, okay, yeah, you write it. And so that became my transition into being a screenwriter. You know, in fact, there's a guy who I said at one point, I go, they can't keep saying no to me writing. They can't. And he goes, oh, they 100% can. He said, until you show them that you can write a script, they just know you as a comic book writer and you'll be a comic book writer until you can do it. And so it's like, so then I did it and they loved it. So,
How
and
different
then over the years, was it?
how different was it? I mean, like you were writing stories for comics and then you started to write the screenplay for live action projects and stuff. So is it a seismic difference between the two mediums?
I don't think so. And here's why is that when you're writing a comic book, you're telling the story in words and pictures. And similarly, when you're writing a screenplay, you have to be aware of the words and the pictures that you can't just be like, Vin Diesel and Paul Walker getting a car and then they are sitting at the drive through and they're talking for 15 minutes. Like they may be saying so much profound stuff, or they might be so funny, or they might be like so emotional because Vin's telling Paul about, his first bike and you're like, it might be that way, but you have to use the story, you have to use the words and the pictures. So as you're writing, you have to be like, they're in the car, and then suddenly, the car veers off a cliff, and then it leaps a ravine, and while that's happening, they're saying this and saying that, and da da da. And so, like, if you imagine if you turned in a movie script and you just had 102 pages of words, they'd be like, "What?" You're like, "Oh no, my dialogue is so amazing that if you just shoot the script, the audience is gonna lose their shit because I'm so great." And they're like, "Yeah, no, that's not how it works." And similarly, you don't want to turn in 102 pages of them driving and doing the steering wheel, and they get a flat tire and they get out, but they don't even get out. One guy's driving, the other guy gets out and fixes the tire while the other guy's driving. Oh my God, that's amazing. But we're not learning anything about the characters. We're just learning action. So we're watching action. And so what you have to learn to do as a screenplay writer is to make sure that you're telling the story, but you're also doing the dialogue and also giving camera directions uh, to the cameraman and stuff. And so so that made it really, I don't want to say tremendously easy, but it was not a difficult transition at all because, you're used to, I always say that writing is math. People always go, "Oh, I want to be a writer." And I go, "Okay, well, the secret to writing is math." And they're like, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, it's like this. It's like in a comic book, generally, you have 22 pages. Out of those 22 pages, you can get an average of 6 panels per page. Sometimes there'll be one panel, a splash page. Other times it'll be 9 panels or 10 panels, depending. Like George Perez used to, you look at George's work, he would have like 16 panels. You're like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. But there's not many George Perez's left. And so, okay, so look at the math. You have 22 pages, 6 panels per page, and an average of 35 words per panel. Some panels will have more words, some panels will have less words, but an average of that. So that's what you have to work with. So you can't theoretically decide, I'm going to do 8 pages of trying to open up the pickle jar in the Avengers kitchen. Vision's trying to open it, and then Cap comes in and he's like, "Oh, let me get that for you." Can't do that. So the thing is that you want to use your page count to tell the story in the most concise and dramatic way as you can.
Right.
Similarly, if you have 102 pages, you have essentially 20 pages up front, uh, 60 pages in the middle, and then another 20 pages at the end. So your first act and your second act are 20 minutes long, and in the middle, you have 60 minutes of story once you get everything in place. And then out of that, you want to have a halfway mark twist. So the audience and the characters think they're doing one thing, and then suddenly they find out that, oh my God, this is like Bruce Willis. I thought I was here to save my wife from these terrorists. Turns out they're not terrorists. Turns out they're bank robbers, and they're going to blow up the whole building and kill everybody. So I still have to save my wife, but I have to save everybody. So it's Aaron Brockovich just wanted a job for Aaron. She just wanted a job, and she talked the lawyer into giving her a job. And then she is proud of herself because she brought him a case. But then it turns out that the people that she trusted her to bring the case are suddenly getting screwed because they're getting like, $30,000 offers instead of the 330 million that they eventually settled at. You think, okay, this is her and she's getting, oh, thank God she got a job. and it's a simple job and she's doing very well at it. But all of a sudden, boom, just like he figures out that it's not about the necessarily saving his wife, it's about these terrorists who are going to level Nakatomi Plaza and kill everybody. Similarly, Aaron, we're rooting for her. Okay, you got the job. That's great. You don't have any experience, but blah, blah, blah. But then suddenly she's the linchpin to this class action lawsuit. So it's, in every one of these movies, there's that twist where you're halfway through and all of a sudden you go, oh, I didn't see that coming. So, but you want your first act done in 20 minutes. And when you watch a movie, you'll notice that you can almost look at your watch for most movies, not Tarantino because he's crazy, but if you're watching a movie and Chris Tucker and
Jackie Chan.
yeah have decided to work together, even though they don't like each other, guess what? It's exactly 20 minutes. You can set your watch by it. And halfway through, they're like, oh, well, we just need to solve this case. But then, oh no, it's the, Yakuza and, it's a huge, huge drug shipment. If we don't stop it, the fentanyl is going to come into the country and kill everybody. And that happens exactly halfway through the second act. And then at the end of the second act, guess what? They screwed up, and poor Jackie has to go back to his country, and Chris is kicked onto desk duty. And then Chris has an idea, and he gets on the plane, and he has to talk Jackie into getting off the plane because we're going to solve it. Even if the rest of the police aren't going to back us up, we have to do it. And that's like 50 movies, and it'll be 50 more movies, and it doesn't matter if it's that or it's Bring It On. Like, look, we tried to get in the nationals and we couldn't do it because we didn't have an original piece. And then it's like, we'll stay up all night and we're going to have that original piece and we're going to, and it's like every movie. So you got, and it's not, people say, well, Scott, that's a formula, but you're being a hack. It's not a formula. It's a format. If you're watching a movie and it goes past 20 minutes and you're like, okay, Jackie Chan and, Chris Tucker, but they haven't met yet. And now it's like the movie's 30 minutes. Like, what's going on? And then it's like, my God, it's been 40 minutes. What is this movie about? Like that's why, you want a format. You want to exist within that format. And what you put in it makes a good movie or a bad movie, but it's that format. And similarly with the comic book, you can say, oh, I want a splash page when Storm enters and she drops down. It's very dramatic, but
Right.
you can't. I want a dramatic picture of Storm landing, but I want it on the next page. I want it from a different angle. And then on the third page, I want it to be like, we're up in the sky with her and we're looking down as she lands. And it's like, you know, no, you don't do that. You get that page, you make it dramatic, and then the next page is everybody reacting to her. So there's just things that you're restricted in some ways, but that's fine because really when you think about it, I'll say this, is that people used to get mad about the crossovers. Readers would be, oh, there's another crossover, blah, blah, blah. And when it happened to me and I would get a crossover, I said, oh my God, it's like, imagine if every issue you did was a postage stamp. And then suddenly a crossover comes on. And I don't know if you can see this out my window. Let's see. You see that garage over there? See that woman?
Yes, I see that mural.
Yeah. So imagine if every day you come to work and they say, here, draw on this postage stamp, which is a single issue. And then they go, hey, we want you to come in and work on this big event. You're going to have an entirely different, you're not going to draw that the size of a postage stamp and then be like, my job is done. Instead you have this huge amount of, a much larger canvas to work from. And so your story is going to be epic. You can make it epic now instead of this. So that's, again, like it's not a matter of being I don't want to use the word hack, and I'm not saying it's about what's the word? My friend just walked in, so I'm distracted for a second. I'm sorry. The difference is, it's like I say, it's the format, and how you fill that format is up to you, but you have to stay within the context of the format. And when I hope I've given you the example that comic book writing and movie writing are almost identical in the what's the word, the skill sets that you need.
So the
You just change it.
skill set is pretty much similar, but the formats are differing, which is quite understandable.
I hope that was informative and enlightening.
Very informative because quite a lot of people within my community who are into filmmaking, who are into this sort of, basically who need the understanding. I mean, you explained it pretty skillfully, I must say, and I'm not surprised because you've been writing amazing stories for decades now. Now, one thing is that what should your fans be looking forward to when it comes to your work for Hollywood?
It's kind of hard to say because with comic books, you're there month after month after month. And solicits will tell people that 3 months from now, this book will be released. Happy Death Day, from the time I wrote it to the time it got on screen, was 10 years. 10 years.
10 years.
So, yeah. I'd be in a cab and people go, "What are you doing?" I say, "I'm a writer." And they go, "What do you write?" And I go, "Oh, it's called Happy Death Day. It's about a sorority girl that keeps getting brutally murdered and reliving the day. And each time she relives the day, she gets another clue as to who's trying to kill her and how to stop him." They go, "Oh my God, that's fascinating. When's that coming out?" And I'd be like, "Someday." So similarly, it's hard for me to promote something that could not be, or it could be 4 years from now. But I'll just give you an example. Like, wrote a script with my friend called Odin, and right now we just yesterday signed the final paperwork with the studio. We wrote it about 4 years ago. Uh, they say they're going to have it in front of cameras in September, and then it takes, I don't know, 6 months, a year to edit. So technically, it would be a year and a half from now. If you gave me a nickel for every time I heard we're going to get it in front of the cameras by September or October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, November, um, I would be so rich. I would not even ever have to do a podcast. So just kidding. I love that. And I do them for free. Don't let anybody think that I
Oh,
okay.
absolutely. I mean, we are grateful to you for that, sir. Okay, now is
But
the
that's right. So Odin could be, oh, I was just saying, Odin, this movie we're working on, could be out in a year and a half, or it could be out in 5 years. It could be out in 6. You just don't know. So it's out of your hands. So I hate to talk about things that are going to happen until they happen.
understood, sir. Okay, sir. Now the bit about the community and the patrons and everyone. First up, uh, I asked the community about which was their favorite crossover event from the 90s when it came to X-Men. No surprise, it was a and the second most beloved one was X-Men Onslaught.
But that's 2 in a row.
Yeah.
That could be because you interviewed me. If you interviewed someone else, they'd be like, "I like Krakoa better, but Krakoa's the best." And if they ask Chris, they'd be like, "I like the one where they went to Australia. That was the best." You know.
No, I framed the question deliberately by saying that which is your favorite crossover event from the 90s.
Okay. Well, then that was definitely me. Okay.
So, in that respect, and the choices I had mentioned were all of those crossover events where you were involved. I mean, as you know, like it turns out that the projects where you were in the driver's seat, they turned out to be the most popular amongst the community in Saudi Arabia. To the
Thank you. I should. If I go there, would they make me a king or a sheik or something? Or
sir, you will be welcomed and you will be treated like a royal guest. not only by the members of the royal family, but also the common individuals that are here. Because hospitality is a serious thing over here. I mean, like, you can be you can have all sorts of temperaments, but when it comes to hospitality in this part of the world, people just don't hold back.
You're saying I shouldn't bring my wallet.
Yeah, obviously.
Everybody will be like, if I'm hungry, they'll be like, here.
It's not like here. You will be like you will be welcomed like a royal guest, like a state guest. Because by
Anybody give me a puppy to take home?
that's not part of the custom. But what they will give you is maybe a feast of the finest lamb or a camel. Okay,
I've never had.
it's delicious. It's delicious. One of the best meats out there. One of the best proteins on God's green earth.
Well, do me a favor, you would.
Please tell
If
me.
you do feed me camel, tell me about it afterwards. Okay. Don't say you're gonna eat camel because a camel because I'll be like, hmm? But if you go, hey,
Under
how was that? Oh, that
understood.
was delicious. And then you go, camel, and point to your back like a hump, and I'll be like, oh, okay, camel, get it.
Understood, sir. And that's a promise. Once you reach here in Jeddah, inshallah, or in any other city of Saudi Arabia, we will make sure that you get the best camel feast, inshallah. And now for the questions.
You been to America?
Yes, I've been to the US back in 1994 when you were with Marvel Comics and you were planning.
I said that.
Were
How so bad I didn't say hi.
because you'll be surprised at what I'm going to share with you right now. You know, for us who are outside of the US, we just cannot imagine how open America is. Now it's much more, we are much more familiar because of the media, the travel, and everything. But in those days, when my dad, when my mom and dad took us to the US, first and foremost, it was a monumental challenge for my dad to prepare for this trip financially. And because we come from a middle class background, we're not rich people. My dad was a white collared salesman for a conglomerate, one of the largest conglomerates in the company. But then again, the salary was pretty limited, if you will. So when we landed in the US, for us, it was inconceivable that we can go to the offices of Marvel Comics, and DC was also in New York back then, and we can just, ask them that, do you guys give a tour? And they would let you have a tour. We would think, no, this is like a no-go area, and like only the people who work there can go. So that remains one of my greatest regrets. Why? Because that was a time when Stan Lee was alive. That was a time a lot of legends were alive. That was a time when you, along with Fabian Nicieza, Larry Hama, Adam Kubert, Andy Kubert, you guys were all basically doing all of these one amazing story after another. When I learned about it very late in life, that Marvel gives tour to people when they visit their office or something like that, believe me, it was a very painful moment for me because I kept on hating myself that, man, I was there, I was in New York City, I was staying in Queens, I did go to Manhattan. How could I miss this? Anyhow,
Did you ever imagine that 20 years later you could hop on a Zoom call and talk to, it's pretty fascinating.
yes, it is. Because in those days, this could only be done by GI Joes from their pit headquarters, and they would be in contact with the Pentagon, or it would be done by people at CNN. But we could not imagine things like these, that I am interviewing Scott Lobdell. I had the honor to interview JM De Mateus. I had the honor to interview Michael Uslan just through Zoom. Anyways, Michael Uslan, I had the opportunity to meet him also personally here in Jeddah. So, yes, you are absolutely right that if I missed out on that part, it got compensated in a great way through the miracles of technology that we have right.
Makes you wonder what another 25 years is going to look like.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Okay, sir, can I start with the questions that I got for you, my patron and my community, patrons and my community?
Yes.
Now, the first question is, why did Chris Claremont replace you on Fantastic Four?
My contract was coming up in 6 months. It was going to uh, they said, we're going to renew the contract,
Uh-huh.
but the company was not offering the type of contracts that I was getting at the time. So I said, okay, I'm not going to remain exclusive because it was like, a third of what I was making. And I had other companies who were saying, what are you making at Marvel? We'll pay you this much and that much.
Right.
And so I'm like, I would rather not be exclusive so that I can remain and pick options, pick properties and do stories that I wanted to do. So I was like, I'll take a page rate and I won't be on contract anymore. And they, okay. Then they said they were mad at me because, they wanted me to stay working, for less money or whatever. It wasn't slave money. It was just less money. And I was like, no, I'll just take my chances. So then I was at issue 3 at the time, and they had a meeting and they came and they said, you're going to get tired of working for page rate. So you're eventually going to quit. So we're just going to end it now with issue 3. And the solicits said that I was going to write issue 4, but because of at the time the numbers were still strong enough that if you swapped out a writer, it would give the retailers the ability to go, we want our money back because you said Scott and you gave us Chris.
Right.
And not that I'm better than Chris, I'm not, but the idea is that because you said this and we got this instead, we don't have to pay for these books. So what Marvel did was say, okay, Scott, it's too late for solicits and your name is already on the actual printed copy or whatever. So we're going to say Scott and Chris wrote it together. Scott plotted and Chris, you know, wrote it. And I said, okay, that's fine. Whatever works for you. I don't want to cause any trouble. So that's why I was off. But technically, I really didn't. I mean, I ended at 3, but people think I ended at 4, but I really didn't. I ended at 3. And they were great 3 issues. Oh my God, I loved writing Fantastic Four. It was so much fun. But so that's why it wasn't, it was really just it was a contract dispute, but then they were trying to be punitive. They were trying to be like, well, if you're not going to work for us, we don't even want you working for us. I'm like, all right, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'll see you later. So, um, but if it were up to me, I would have stayed on. My run on Fantastic Four would have been as long as my run on the X-Men. I loved working on Fantastic Four. And at one point where things started to go a little south, is I said to Bob, and I talked to you about this, a variation of this the other day, but like I never wanted to be that guy who was like grabbing onto the keyboard with both hands as they're trying to wheel you away and wheel somebody else in. I
Yeah.
mean, God bless Peter David, God bless, on Hulk, God bless Chris on X-Men. Everybody does, all these people did amazing work. And then there comes a point where they're like, okay, we're going to go with someone else. We're going to do this. And I didn't want to be that guy that was like, no, the X-Men are mine. No one will touch them. I sound like Dr. Smith now. No, no one will ever write the X-Men. Why would we let someone else write the X-Men? Yeah, I didn't want to be that guy. And I told Bob, I said, listen, the X-Men's really strong. They don't need me to survive. Let me take the Fantastic Four. Maybe I can do what I did, and make not that I didn't make the X-Men the best sellers that they had been before I got there. I do think that I did things that made it sell more or stay higher longer, but it's not as if, it's not as if they weren't doing well before I got there and they were doing well when I left. So I'm not delusional in thinking, but so that's why I left.
Yes, sir. Another very interesting question I got was, why was Angel ruined. His wings were damaged and amputated. Whose idea was this storyline?
Are you talking about the original? I'm not sure what you mean.
When Angel's real wings, because when you had joined the X-Men team, Angel was still Archangel.
Yes.
But then later on, original wings, his original mutation had resurfaced back.
Yes.
So the questioner is asking that his wings were damaged and then amputated. Whose idea was this storyline?
I don't remember them ever being amputated. When were they amputated?
No, I think this question, now that I read it again, I realize maybe he is referring to the X Factor story when Angel had committed suicide after he had lost his wings.
That's depressing.
I have that issue where Angel commits, Warren Worthington of X Factor commits suicide.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah.
Because the,
So that the person doesn't feel cheated, I will answer a variation on that question, which is why did I give him his wings back, his feathered wings back after
exactly.
he Angel? And my feeling is that, like, as strictly as a fan, and I don't know what year it came out, but I don't remember how old I was when X Factor came out. But I remember being very disappointed because I, I read an interview about why Angel got his metal wings, and the interview said something along the lines of, well, the X-Men are really powerful. Cyclops can knock over a building, Jean can, control everybody's mind as far as she can see. Iceman could build a mountain out of ice if he wanted to.
Right.
Um, the Beast changed his whole body. He did what, from one to the other, and he's a brilliant scientist. And Warren is some guy with wings. So we're gonna make him cool, and we're gonna give him metal wings. And he's gonna be like this death, this archangel of death.
Yeah.
That's gonna be cool. And I was like, that's not what I want. Like, as a fan, I like the fact that Warren was hanging around with these super, super, super powerful people. I
Right.
liked it, like, showed up at in the Champions with Ghost Rider and Hercules, and
Black
and
Widow.
to me, that's what I did say Champions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, champions. Yeah.
Yeah. And I said that to me is what I find exciting. Like, I think the fact that here's a guy who all he has is wings and what's the word? Hollow bones,
Right.
Like, that's the guy who I think is interesting, flying into to fight Magneto. What can he do besides fly, distract him? At one point he had a mace. That's the guy. That's the interesting guy. Somebody without any power other than to fly. And I'm like, that is admirable. I don't know if you gave me a power to go up against Magneto and you go, you want to fight? I'd be like, you got anything else in there? And so that's why at one point I was like, you know what? When I was in a position to bring him back to the wings, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to have him just wake up in an alleyway and have his wings. And people were like, what? You can't do that. I go, I just did.
But I have to say one thing, that when me and my brother were reading Executioner's Song, and in the issues of Uncanny X-Men during Executioner's Song, the dialogue that you wrote between, this enraged Warren Worthington, aka Archangel, becoming bloodthirsty to take out Apocalypse, and Apocalypse is basically like presenting himself that, okay, it is for me an honor to be taken out by the fittest, for I am not the fittest of all at the moment, because he got really badly beaten up by Strife. So it's one of my and my brother's favorite panels to this day. Okay, final questions is that now that you have transitioned to Hollywood, can we expect Scott Lobdell to write X-Men again if the opportunity comes to him, or you're done with comics?
I'm sorry, you're talking about the X-Men comics, or you're talking about X-Men in Hollywood? Hollywood.
X-Men Hollywood, I think you are now much more closer to doing that, but What about the comics? I'd like you to share your
I don't.
response.
I. I. If someone asked, I would consider it and consider. Like if I was, if I had something left to say on the X-Men. Um, but that is not going to happen. So they're not going to ask. And if they don't ask,
You mean for comics? They're not gonna ask for comics.
they're not going to ask for comment. I think part of the reason why is because all these people have been there for 30 years now. You know them. I'm not trying to mask it, but like, the Dan Buckleys and the Tom Brevoorts, there's a thing in their heads where they're like, well, the X-Men was really, really in the crapper and Marvel was really, really bad. And then we fixed it. In the 90s, it was terrible, but we fixed it.
Ah,
And it's like, if you think that way, then you're never going to go back to the guy that wrote it in the 90s and be like, what do you think? So, so that's never going to happen. They're too emotionally invested in believing that the X-Men were in the toilet and that they came by and saved the day. So, so until they have a point of view where they go, oh, wow, there are a lot of amazing things that happened in the 90s. Who's writing the books in the, until they have that realization, they're not, it's never going to happen. So, as far as the movies go, like I don't, I'm not trying to be mean to anybody, but I will be honest. It's that like, I wish they would stop with the multiverse, you know,
mhm.
like at the end, even at the end of Marvels, where like all of a sudden the woman wakes up and there's the Beast, Kelsey Grammer.
Yes.
It's like, oh my God, that's great. So the X-Men, who always lived in a world that fears and hates them, turns out they've been doing stuff, saving the day, doing all this. Maybe they weren't in the public spotlight when Thanos was around, but they were doing X-Men stuff.
Right.
That was the assumption when I saw Kelsey Grammer. And
Right.
then he's like, "Oh, but wait, you're from an alternate dimension, reality in the multiverse." And I was like, like I wish they would stop. There's no need to, keep going back to that well,
Yeah.
you know. And so, but I don't see them ever asking, I mean, we've talked a few times, and I don't know, did I talk about Don Blake last time?
Don Blake. No.
Remember who Don Blake is, right?
Yes, Donald Blake, the alter ego of Thor.
Yes. And I said, there was a time, I don't know, 20 years ago, something where, one person's like, I'm going to have Clark Kent say I'm Superman. And somebody else is like, oh, I'm going to have Iron Man or Tony Stark say I'm Iron Man.
Right.
And it's like, oh, I'm doing Steve Rogers is Captain America. And somebody goes, oh, I'm going to have Matt Murdock. Matt Murdock's going to say he's, what? And like went on and on. And it's like, to me, part of what made Marvel so fascinating, I know you use Superman as an example, but what I loved about comic books when I was a kid was the secret identity. That was cool because, it was like you and me and any minute could rip open our shirts and have a, S on it. And suddenly it's, I'm Super Scott or whatever. But like it gave you the idea that anybody could be a superhero.
Right.
And maybe we all have gifts that we kind of hide and put off to the side and, and so, but Marvel dropped it. Superman DC for the most part dropped it. I mean, who doesn't know who Peter Parker, that Peter Parker is Spider-Man now? I mean, the list is
Exactly.
long, you know,
Yeah.
the list is longer than everybody who was ever an Avenger, you know, like even that, remember when we were younger, the Avengers were, Thor, Cap, Iron Man, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And the Iron Man, I mean, sorry, maybe, Wonder Man showed up, Schwartzman, and you start to go, okay, that now it's almost impossible to go into the Marvel universe and go. It used to be. I'll just say this: in the old days, if you're a superhero, you're Daredevil, you're swinging around, and something happens, the sky goes dark, cars start melting into the pavement, and you're like, oh my god, what am I going to do? And then on the last page, the Avengers showed up,
Yeah.
and you were like, holy shit, things are really bad when the Avengers show up. And it was this rarefied air that if you were the best of the best, you became an Avenger. I think three superheroes in the Marvel Universe have not been Avengers, you know. And every time like, oh, the Avengers, and then it was almost a scene in Endgame
Mhm.
where the panels started opening up and like everybody showed up and this one from that movie showed up and this one from that movie showed up. It's like, okay, so literally let's stop calling them superheroes and we'll just call everybody an Avenger, you know? Like it loses if everybody's an Avenger, you lose what it means to be an Avenger. And if everybody's superhero identity is just part of who they are, or the other way around, it's you just lose. I think you lose a tremendous amount of what made characters interesting. And when I was talking to Marvel, I said, like Chris has done a really good job playing Thor, but he's vain and he's, ah, ha, ha, and you're always laughing at Thor. He's such a himbo. But if you go back to the original idea of this lame doctor who is essentially humbled by his disability,
Yeah.
that he's Thor, but also Thor has been humbled because Odin said, you're going to be a human and you're not going to be the most powerful. You're going to be walking around with a bum leg and a cane. And to me, like that fascinated me for the first, 20 years of Thor. And then when it became to the point where, like in the movie, it's just Thor. He's always been Thor and, he's been immortal and that doesn't interest me. So,
It was a powerful. It was.
but message, but also, like I say, it wasn't just the example of Thor. It was the example of all like we've lost that identity thing. Remember when Captain America was a comic book writer living or a comic book artist living in Brooklyn, dating Bernie? It was like, what the heck? That's not, it was awesome the things they would give these people to do. But now it's like,
Right.
because they don't feel as grounded as they did. So,
Yeah.
so within that context, if I ever were to write a Marvel based movie, that's what I would find interesting and that's what I would explore. Not so much the X.
The con. Okay. I'm really glad that
Unless I could take like one, if
yeah.
I could take one, if I could take one X-Men and do a story around him, something that wasn't Wolverine, that would be a challenge. That would be fun, you know.
Would be your choice.
Oh, all those people right there on your shirt, everyone like the Beast would be awesome, Scott Cyclops would be awesome. Everybody, I mean, they're all I'll tell you this is that, years ago they would say, well, we can't spin off the character because none of the characters work except for Logan. We've tried the Storm, we've tried, all these characters and it never worked. And I would always sarcastically say, it would work is to do a really good story and then see, you know, like tell a really good Storm story, tell a really good Rogue story. Let's see how that works. Let's not just be like Storm should get her own story and Iceman should get his own story and Rogue should get her own story. It's like, let's not do it that way. Let's find a story to tell and just blow the doors off it, And in a way, that's what Cyclops and Phoenix does, you know.
Understood.
Cyclops and Phoenix could have been they getting revenge from Mastermind, Didn't he turn you into Phoenix? Yeah, he did. Okay, we're gonna, find him and he's in a jail cell. We're gonna beat him up or whatever it is. It could have been anything. It should certainly not have been, going into the future and, like if you heard it in theory, you'd be like, what? How's he not recognized? Well, because she's red and he's slim and, they're not using their powers. So he doesn't know. He's a kid. What do you know? If your parents died and 20 years later you saw them and they were different names, they didn't have super, he'd have a wholly different experience. So that was how you could have them raise you without knowing that there were Cyclops and Phoenix. Question, what character would I want? I think I want any character, just so long as I could do something with it, you know?
With that, our interview with the highly esteemed Mr. Scott Lobdell.
Cheers to you and me and our highly esteemedness. And just so you know, this is a watermelon probiotic. You know what's funny? One time I did a interview at a comic book convention in San Diego, and the interviewer, who was very popular, she's still very popular all these years later. And I don't know if you've noticed, I have a propensity to, if I'm concentrating, if you say, you know, do you like Professor X or Magneto, which you like better? I will often be like, who do I like better, Magneto or Wolverine? I would have to, or whatever it is. I have to hear the question again in my head to sink in sometimes.
Right.
And so I'm doing this interview, and I get a big gulp. You know, I didn't mean to, but it was at a baseball park. And, you know, I'm like, oh, I'll take a soda. What do you want? Anything, Scott? Yeah, I'll take a soda. So they bring me the soda, and it's huge. And so I'm doing the interview, and I think it's going well. I'm talking and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, you start seeing in the comments, they're like, I can't believe he's drunk. Why would he be drunk? Who would ever do an interview drunk? I'm like, I'm not drunk. I'm just weird. Like, I'm just repeating the question because I need to hear it, or like I'm thinking about it. I'm looking up off to the side. I mean, you've interviewed me now. Like you see, I'm, you know, a little, I'm not on the spectrum or anything. No offense to anyone who is, but I get it. I'm off. I understand, but you know, I talk a little different. I think a little different, but you know, but now suddenly people are, oh, I can't believe Scott Bell was drunk. I'm like, okay, well, I don't even drink, so that puts a little hole in your story. But you literally can't go around the internet defending yourself 24 hours a day because you'll just do it again tomorrow.
Waste of time and energy, and not advisable at all. I'm really grateful to you, Mr. Scott Lobdell, for giving my community a great deal of time to take us through your journey with the X-Men, with DC's New 52, with your experience at Hollywood. To my community who have read The Age of Apocalypse, who have read X-Men Onslaught, who have read all the crossovers from the 90s, which had Scott Lobdell associated with them. To those younger generation who watched X-Men 97 and saw shades of Operation Zero Tolerance and Fatal Attraction being adapted in that animated series, this is the man in the red shades who was behind all of them.
I was younger then. Oh my God, I was so cute. Holy moly. And listen, don't think I'm not going to write more comic books. I'm just, you know, I don't see a future writing for Marvel or DC, but that doesn't mean you won't be reading more comics from me in the future. So
That in mind, Mr. Lobdell, and taking this opportunity, I would like to thank you on behalf of my community, every X-Men fan in the Arabian Peninsula. We are extremely grateful to you for your valuable time for our podcast.
well, I am thankful for your interest, and I'm thankful for having people and talking to people like 30 years ago. I mean, how many people, like, how old are you? Can I ask?
I'm 45, son.
Okay, so how many times do people say, "Hey, we want to interview you from when you were 15?" You'd be like, "What?" You know? So I think that all these like 30 years later, people are still interested in the work is very, very, very flattering. So because I certainly didn't think that would be the case when I was writing, you know. You write Age of Apocalypse not because you're writing a epic that'll be remembered for, you know, 40 years. You write it because it's the issue is due in 2 weeks. And then suddenly people are like, oh, hey, look at this. And you're like, oh, okay, thanks.
In fact, this is what I always remind my guests. I tell them, I remind them, in fact, not tell them, but remind them that you do not realize how far and wide your work or your works have influenced lives of many?
Well, I will tell you something. At the beginning of my career, people would say, because I was a stand-up for years while I was breaking in, and people say, like, what's the difference between, being a stand-up? Even now today, people are like, well, do you ever feel bad, stop doing comedy to do the writing? And I said, well, here's the thing is, in comedy, you get on stage and you tell a joke, and the audience laughs or doesn't laugh. And if they don't laugh, you don't get to go back and go, oh, you know what? Wait, okay, wait, let me try that. Just it's like just have to and get through your if you're funny or if you're not. They laugh or they don't laugh.
True.
It's on and off. It's A or B. But with writing, you write something and 10 years later somebody goes, wait, oh my God, you wrote that. I love that. Oh wow. I remember I was in a bus and suddenly you're back 10 years as they're talking about the story, or you're back 30 years, or somebody comes up and like, oh my God, I cried like a baby when Ileana died, or I was so angry at you, or I thought it's the dumbest issue I ever read. Honestly, you get feedback in comedy. You get feedback instantly, and in writing, you cannot get. Sometimes it's you go to Puerto Rico, you go to Mexico, you go to Saudi Arabia, and people you haven't spoken to them before, and they come up and they're like, "Oh my God, I love this history. I love this story. I love this character." And you're like, "Oh wow, that's interesting." Like all these years later, people still have something in their heart for this story that you wrote. And Age of Apocalypse is a perfect example. I mean, it was arduous because there was pressure to, make sure the sales didn't drop when we canceled all the books and started over for 4 months. That's pretty crazy. But so there's all those things, and that's all you're concentrating on. Back then, we had trade paperbacks, but you would never think 30 years ago, I would never be like, "Oh, they just released Onslaught again."
Yeah.
Practice me, but not Onslaught. Onslaught I made up. What the heck who's carrying on about that 30 years? But here we are. So it's interesting. And again, I'm grateful.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And with that, the interview of this very special episode of Superheroes of Arabia podcast comes to an end. See you all next time.
I'm so lonely.
No, sir.